Picture a sunny afternoon in a crowded national park. Families spread across picnic blankets, hikers passing every few minutes, rangers on patrol. A 7-year-old boy asks his father if he can walk ahead to the next trail marker. Barely 30 meters away, still within sight, his father watches him go, looks down to tie his boot. And when he glances up, 8 seconds later, his son has vanished. No scream, no struggle, no trace. Within minutes, hundreds of searchers comb every inch of that trail. They find nothing. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, not a single clue. That boy's disappearance is just one of thousands of cases that have occurred in North America's wilderness areas. Cases that follow patterns too strange to ignore, too consistent to dismiss. Tonight, we're going deep into the woods, where the missing don't leave trails and the explanations don't add up. The afternoon of June 13th, 1969, started like any other family hike in Yosemite National Park. Dennis Martin, a 6-year-old boy from Tennessee, was exploring with his father and grandfather along a well-traveled path near Spence Field. The weather was clear, visibility extended for hundreds of meters, and other hikers were scattered across the meadow. Dennis asked if he could run ahead to a spot where the trail curved behind a small stand of trees, no more than 45 meters away. His father nodded, watched him jog forward, and bent down to adjust his pack. When he looked up less than 10 seconds later, Dennis was gone. The stand of trees Dennis had run toward wasn't dense forest. It was a small cluster of pines barely thick enough to obscure the view, the kind of natural feature hikers pass without a second thought. His father called out immediately, expecting Dennis to pop back into view, perhaps distracted by a squirrel or an interesting rock. When no answer came, he walked quickly to the spot where he'd last seen his son. The area was empty. The trail continued straight ahead with clear sightlines for another 100 meters. There were no side paths, no thick brush to wander into. Nowhere for a small boy to hide or get turned around. Within minutes, other hikers had joined the search. They spread out in a systematic grid, calling Dennis's name, checking behind every tree and boulder within earshot of where he'd vanished. The grandfather ran back down the trail to alert park rangers, while Dennis's father remained at the spot, refusing to leave in case his son returned. The temperature was mild, around 18 degrees Celsius, with no wind. Visibility remained excellent as the afternoon stretched on. These were ideal conditions for a search, the kind of situation where finding a lost child should have been straightforward. By the time the first ranger arrived, roughly 25 minutes had passed since Dennis disappeared. The ranger immediately radioed for additional support and began organizing the growing crowd of volunteer searchers into coordinated teams. He noted the location carefully. Spence Field, elevation approximately 1,500 meters, terrain moderate, weather clear. The area was well known to park staff, frequently hiked, with no unusual hazards. There were no steep drop-offs nearby, no water deep enough to be dangerous, no areas of unstable ground. It was, by all measures, one of the safer locations in the park. As the sun began its descent toward the western ridges, more rangers arrived with tracking dogs. The dogs were given items of Dennis's clothing to establish his scent, then released to work. They moved with purpose toward the stand of trees, following the path Dennis had taken. Then, approximately 15 meters past where his father had last seen him, the dogs stopped. Handlers encouraged them forward, but the animals circled the same small area, whining and sitting down repeatedly, the signal that a scent trail has ended. Not faded, not crossed by other scents, but ended, as if Dennis had simply stopped existing at that precise point on the trail. The handlers tried multiple dogs throughout the evening, each selected from different agencies to avoid any possibility of training bias. Every single dog tracked Dennis's scent to approximately the same spot, then indicated the trail's termination. Experienced trackers examined the ground for footprints, disturbed pine needles, any indication of which direction a 6-year-old boy might have gone. As darkness fell on June 13th, 1969, Dennis Martin had been missing for roughly 6 hours. He had vanished in 10 seconds, from open terrain, in clear weather, while being watched by his father. And despite immediate response from trained searchers, it was as if he had never been there at all. 2. The first search, when hundreds found nothing. Within 20 minutes of Dennis Martin's disappearance, park rangers had mobilized the first search teams. By nightfall, more than 60 trained personnel were combing the area with flashlights and dogs. The search would eventually grow to over 1,400 people, including Green Berets, FBI agents, and local volunteers, making it one of the largest manhunts in National Park Service history. Helicopters swept overhead with thermal imaging, bloodhounds traced scent trails that inexplicably stopped mid-path, and every cave, crevice, and creek bed within a 5-mile radius was searched repeatedly. Yet, after a week of relentless effort, not a single piece of physical evidence was found. No clothing fibers, no footprints, no signs of struggle. The scale of the search operation was unprecedented. By the second day, over 400 people were actively searching, divided into systematic grid patterns that covered every square meter of terrain within a 2-mile radius of Dennis's last known position. Experienced mountaineers rappelled down cliff faces to check ledges. Cave explorers entered every underground opening, no matter how small. Divers searched the cold waters of nearby streams and pools, though none were deep enough to conceal a body for long. Every search team maintained detailed logs of exactly which areas they had covered, at what time, and what they had found. The logs showed the same thing repeatedly. Nothing. The Green Berets arrived on day 3. Specialists in tracking and land navigation who had recently returned from Vietnam. These were men trained to find people who didn't want to be found, operating in some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. They approached the search with military precision, using techniques developed for combat operations. They found nothing. FBI agents with expertise in child abduction cases interviewed every person who had been in the area, searching for any indication of foul play, any suspicious individuals, any vehicles that didn't belong. They found no evidence of human involvement. The searches continued around the clock, with fresh teams rotating in as others rested. Helicopter pilots using forward-looking infrared technology flew grid patterns over the search area during the cool evening hours, when a child's body heat would create the strongest thermal signature against the ground. The FLIR systems could detect temperature differences of less than 1 degree Celsius, capable of spotting a small animal from hundreds of meters up. They detected deer, bears, and other wildlife, but no trace of Dennis Martin. The helicopters returned each evening for a week, covering an expanding search radius that eventually reached nearly 8 miles from the initial disappearance point. The thermal cameras saw nothing human-sized that wasn't already accounted for. On the ground, bloodhounds were brought in from multiple agencies, each with proven track records in finding missing persons. These weren't ordinary dogs, but animals specifically bred and trained for scent tracking, capable of following a trail that was days old across miles of wilderness. The handlers worked them in rotating shifts to keep the dogs fresh and focused. Time and again, different dogs taken to Dennis's last known location would follow the same path to the same spot, then stop. They would circle, sniff the air, and sit down. Their behavior was consistent. The scent trail ended abruptly. It didn't fade gradually, as it would if Dennis had simply walked beyond their detection range. It stopped, completely and suddenly, as if he had been lifted into the air. Search teams checked every theory, no matter how unlikely. They searched areas that seemed impossible for a 6-year-old to reach, accounting for the chance that fear or disorientation might drive a child to attempt difficult terrain. They checked under fallen logs large enough to trap a small body. They probed deep leaf litter in hollows where someone might have crawled and become covered. They returned to the same locations multiple times, accounting for the possibility that they had somehow missed something on previous passes. After 7 days of exhaustive searching involving over 1,400 personnel covering more than 30 square miles of wilderness, the official search was scaled back. Not a single fibre from Dennis's clothing had been found. Not a footprint, not a drop of blood, not a disturbed plant. It was as if Dennis Martin had ceased to exist the moment he stepped behind those trees. Dennis Martin's case might have remained an isolated tragedy if it weren't for what came next. In the months following his disappearance, researchers began noticing something unsettling in the archives. Children vanishing in national parks wasn't new, but the circumstances surrounding many of these cases shared disturbing similarities. They disappeared in good weather, during daylight hours, often while near family members. Search dogs would track their scent to a certain point, then stop as if the trail simply ended in midair. Massive searches yielded nothing, and in the rare cases where bodies were eventually found, they were discovered in areas that had already been thoroughly searched, sometimes multiple times. A park ranger in Crater Lake, Oregon, reading about Dennis Martin's case, felt an uncomfortable recognition. 3 years earlier, in 1966, a 6-year-old boy named Larry Jeffrey Morris had vanished from the Crater Lake area under remarkably similar circumstances. Larry had been with his family at a picnic area, walked a short distance away, and was gone when his parents looked up moments later. The search for Larry involved hundreds of personnel, tracking dogs, and aerial surveys. The dogs had tracked his scent to a specific point, then lost it completely. No trace of Larry was ever found. The ranger pulled the case file and laid it beside the reports from Dennis Martin's disappearance. The parallels were striking. Other cases began surfacing as people compared notes. In 1958, a 2-year-old named Keith Parkins had vanished from flat, open terrain near Ritter, Oregon. His mother looked away for less than 30 seconds. When she turned back, Keith was gone from an area offering no concealment whatsoever. The search found nothing. In 1952, a 4-year-old named Alfred Beilhartz disappeared from Rocky Mountain National Park while hiking with his parents. His parents glanced away briefly to navigate a tricky spot. When they looked up, Alfred had vanished. Massive search. No results, no trace ever found. The similarities weren't just in the circumstances of the disappearances. The search patterns were nearly identical across cases separated by years and thousands of miles. In each case, well-trained search dogs would follow a scent trail that terminated suddenly and completely. In each case, despite rapid response and massive search efforts, no physical evidence was recovered. In each case, the victims were young children who vanished during brief moments of parental distraction, in good weather, from locations that seemed to offer no opportunity for rapid concealment. And in each case, the searches covered areas far larger than a small child could possibly traverse in the time between disappearance and the start of organized searching. Researchers began pulling records from different parks, requesting information through Freedom of Information Act filings. What they discovered was troubling. The National Park Service had no centralized database of missing persons. Each park maintained its own records, in varying formats, with different levels of detail. Some cases were thoroughly documented, others had minimal paperwork. There was no system for identifying patterns across parks or regions. A child could vanish in Yosemite under circumstances identical to a disappearance in the Smokies, and no one would connect the cases because they were filed separately, in different offices with no cross-referencing system. When researchers began manually compiling the data, mapping cases on charts and timelines, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Certain age groups were vastly overrepresented. Toddlers and young children between ages 2 and 6 accounted for a disproportionate number of the mysterious vanishings. The disappearances clustered around specific times of day, with the majority occurring in afternoon hours between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. They concentrated in specific geographical areas, with certain parks showing far higher rates of unexplained disappearances than their visitor numbers would predict. And almost universally, they shared the same frustrating characteristics: rapid vanishing, massive searches finding nothing, terminated scent trails, and complete absence of physical evidence. The pattern was there. It had been there for decades, hidden in separate file cabinets across dozens of park offices, visible only when someone took the time to gather all the cases together and look at them as a whole. Dennis Martin's disappearance wasn't an isolated tragedy. It was one data point in a phenomenon that had been claiming people, especially children, from America's wilderness areas for longer than anyone had realized. And whatever was causing it showed no signs of stopping. Former law enforcement officer David Paulides spent years compiling data on missing persons cases in national parks and wilderness areas across North America. What he found was so consistent, so statistically improbable, that he dedicated his career to documenting it. His research revealed distinct clusters of disappearances, often centered around geographic features like boulder fields, bodies of water, and mountain peaks. The victims fit specific profile patterns: young children, experienced hikers, people with disabilities, and individuals of high intelligence. What troubled Paulides most was the reluctance of park services to maintain a centralized database of these incidents, making it nearly impossible to see the broader pattern until he began mapping it himself. Paulides approached the research with the methodical mindset of an investigator, establishing specific criteria to filter cases that qualified as truly unexplained. The disappearance had to occur in a national park or wilderness area. There had to be no evidence of animal attack or human foul play. The victim's experience level or age had to make the circumstances of the disappearance unusual. Either young children covering impossible distances or experienced outdoorsmen vanishing from familiar terrain. And critically, there had to be unexplained elements. Massive searches, finding nothing. Strange weather events coinciding with the disappearance, or victims eventually found in locations that had already been thoroughly searched. Using these criteria, Paulides identified over 1,600 cases across North America that fit the profile. The data revealed patterns that statistical analysis confirmed were far beyond random chance. Children with blonde or red hair appeared at frequencies much higher than their proportion in the general population. Individuals with high intelligence, as measured by advanced degrees or documented IQ scores, vanished at unexpected rates. People with physical or developmental disabilities were dramatically overrepresented in the data. These weren't subtle trends that could be explained by confirmation bias or selective memory. They were mathematically significant patterns, appearing consistently across hundreds of unrelated cases spanning decades. The geographical clustering was equally striking. When Paulides plotted the cases on topographic maps, certain areas showed concentrations of disappearances that defied random distribution. Yosemite National Park in California had 16 cases meeting the criteria over a 50-year period. The Great Smoky Mountains on the Tennessee-North Carolina border had 11. Crater Lake in Oregon showed 7 disappearances in an area that received fewer total visitors than many other parks with no unusual missing persons reports. Mount Shasta in California had its own cluster, as did specific regions of the Rocky Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and the Cascade Range. What made these clusters particularly strange was their precision. In Yosemite, Paulides found that several of the disappearances occurred within a 200-meter radius of each other, despite being separated by decades. The victims were different ages, genders, and backgrounds. They vanished during different seasons and under different circumstances, yet they all disappeared from essentially the same spot in a park, covering over 1,100 square miles. The statistical probability of such clustering occurring by chance was vanishingly small. Something about these specific locations appeared to be connected to the disappearances, though Paulides could find no obvious common factor. The terrain varied from flat meadows to steep mountains. The elevation ranged from near sea level to over 3,000 meters. Some areas had granite bedrock, others limestone, still others volcanic rock. Paulides' attempts to obtain complete data from the National Park Service met with frustration. When he did receive information, it was frequently incomplete or contradictory. Different parks use different record-keeping systems. Some maintained detailed files on missing persons cases, others had minimal documentation. Paulides found this absence of centralized tracking particularly troubling. The Park Service maintained detailed records of wildlife populations, trail conditions, and visitor injuries. Yet for missing persons, a critical public safety issue, the data was scattered, incomplete, and difficult to access. The resistance to creating a comprehensive database seemed to Paulides to go beyond bureaucratic inefficiency. In several instances, park officials actively discouraged his research or declined to discuss specific cases, citing privacy concerns or ongoing investigations. Yet many of the cases he was researching were decades old, with families who wanted the information public in hopes of finding answers. The pattern of resistance suggested to Paulides that officials either didn't recognize the pattern, unlikely given their access to data, or didn't want the pattern to become widely known. A comprehensive database would make the clustering obvious, potentially raising public concerns about park safety and impacting visitation rates. Without such a database, each case remained isolated, a tragic but seemingly random event, rather than part of a larger, unexplained phenomenon where disappearances concentrate. When Paulides plotted the disappearances on detailed topographic maps, certain locations stood out immediately. Yosemite National Park showed 16 unexplained vanishings over a 50-year period. The Great Smoky Mountains recorded 11. Crater Lake, Mount Shasta, and areas of the Rocky Mountains each had their own troubling concentration of cases. Even more peculiar was the precision of these clusters. In Yosemite, several disappearances occurred within a 200-meter radius of each other, decades apart, despite the park encompassing over 1,100 square miles. It was as if certain specific locations were somehow more prone to these events, though no one could identify what made those spots different. The cluster near Crater Lake, Oregon, was particularly dense. 7 disappearances over a 30-year period, all occurring within a 3-mile radius of the lake's western rim. The victims ranged from toddlers to experienced adult hikers. They vanished in different seasons, under different weather conditions, during different decades, yet they all disappeared from essentially the same area. Geological surveys of the region showed nothing unusual volcanic rock typical of the Cascade Range, no unusual mineral deposits, no documented cave systems that might account for people falling into unmapped spaces. The area received moderate hiking traffic, far less than many other sections of Oregon's wilderness areas that showed no unusual disappearance rates. Yosemite's clusters were even more precise. When Beilhartz marked each disappearance on a large-scale topographic map, using coordinates from search reports and witness statements, 3 distinct hotspots emerged. One near the high country around Tuolumne Meadows, where 5 people had vanished over 4 decades. Another in the Hetch-Hetchy region, with 4 unexplained cases. The third near the valley floor, where 7 people had disappeared, including Dennis Martin and Stacy Arras. Within each hotspot, the disappearances occurred within remarkably small areas. The Tuolumne cluster, for instance, showed all 5 cases occurring within a 300-meter radius, despite the surrounding high country encompassing hundreds of square miles of similar terrain. Researchers examining these clusters looked for common denominators. The Yosemite clusters occurred in areas with different bedrock composition, some granite, some metamorphic rock, some alluvial deposits. Was it elevation? The clusters ranged from near sea level to above 3,000 meters, showing no consistent altitude pattern. Was it vegetation? Some clusters were in dense forest, others in open meadows, still others above the tree line. Was it proximity to water? Some clusters were near lakes or streams, but others were in dry areas far from significant water sources. No single geographical or geological factor appeared in all the cluster zones. The temporal pattern was equally mysterious. The disappearances within each cluster didn't occur at regular intervals that might suggest some cyclical phenomenon. In the Crater Lake cluster, the cases were spread irregularly. 1 in 1966, another in 1974, 2 in 1981, 1 in 1987, 1 in 1992, 1 in 1996. There was no apparent pattern to the timing. Similarly, the Yosemite clusters showed irregular spacing, with some years seeing multiple disappearances and others seeing none, even during periods of similar visitor traffic. Whatever was causing the clustering, it wasn't operating on a predictable schedule. When Beilhartz expanded the analysis beyond the major clusters, he found secondary zones with smaller concentrations. The Crazy Mountains in Montana showed 4 cases in 20 years. Mount Rainier in Washington had 5 over 3 decades. Specific areas of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado showed their own smaller clusters. The pattern repeated across the continent. Certain locations, for reasons no one could identify, showed significantly higher rates of unexplained disappearances than surrounding areas with similar terrain, similar visitor numbers, and similar conditions. Perhaps most troubling was what happened when Beilhartz shared his cluster maps with park officials and search and rescue teams. Many veterans of wilderness SAR operations admitted they already knew certain areas had reputations for disappearances. Some locations were informally known among longtime rangers as places where people went missing more often than elsewhere. Yet this knowledge had never been formally documented, analysed, or used to identify common factors. The clusters existed in the collective memory of experienced personnel, but nowhere in official records. When Beilhartz asked why these patterns hadn't been systematically studied, the responses were vague. Lack of funding, bureaucratic inertia, concern about frightening the public, but the clusters remained, waiting on Paulides' maps like pins on a crime board, marking spots where the ordinary rules seemed to break down, where people stepped into wilderness, and sometimes stepped out of the world entirely. Vanished in a vanished, vanished while, vanished, vanished while, vanished, vanished while. On a clear September afternoon in 1952, 2-year-old Keith Parkins was playing near Ritter, Oregon, in an area surrounded by flat, open terrain. His family was setting up camp when Keith wandered approximately 50 meters away, still visible to his parents. His mother glanced away for what she estimated to be less than 30 seconds to tend to her other child. When she looked back, Keith was gone. The landscape offered nowhere to hide, no trees, no buildings, no ravines. Searchers arrived within minutes and began a systematic sweep that would eventually cover 18 square miles. Despite the quick response and favourable search conditions, Keith Parkins was never found. No tracks, no disturbed soil, nothing to suggest where a toddler could have gone in such a short window of time. The terrain where Keith vanished was perhaps the worst possible location for a mysterious disappearance, precisely because it was so open and featureless. The area was high desert scrubland, characterized by low sagebrush, barely knee-high to an adult, scattered across sandy soil that should have recorded every footprint. Visibility extended in all directions for several hundred meters. There were no gullies deep enough to conceal a child, no dense vegetation to get lost in, no water bodies where someone might drown. It was, by all measures, a location where losing sight of a toddler for even a few seconds should have been nearly impossible. When searchers arrived, they immediately began working outward from Keith's last known position in expanding circles. The sandy soil should have made tracking straightforward. Any movement would leave clear prints. Yet they found nothing. Keith's small footprints were visible, leading away from the camp, moving roughly 50 meters toward a flat area of sparse sagebrush. Then the print simply stopped. Not faded, not obscured by other tracks, but stopped abruptly in the middle of open ground. There were no adult footprints nearby to suggest he'd been carried. No vehicle tracks indicating an abduction. The surrounding soil was undisturbed, showing the natural patterns of wind and weather, with no indication that anything unusual had occurred. Search teams expanded the radius to over 3 miles in the first 24 hours, working under the assumption that perhaps Keith had somehow moved faster and farther than seemed possible for a 2-year-old. They searched every depression in the ground, every cluster of sagebrush, every rocky outcrop that might conceal a small body. Aircraft flew grid patterns overhead, observers scanning for any sign of movement or colour that didn't belong. Local volunteers who knew the area intimately joined the effort, checking locations that maps didn't show: dry creek beds, old mine shafts, abandoned homestead sites. They found nothing. The search continued for days, then weeks, with diminishing hope but unrelenting effort. Tracking dogs were brought in, though by the time they arrived, several days had passed. The dogs showed no interest in any particular direction, unable to establish a trail beyond the point where Keith's footprints ended. As weeks turned to months, the searches became more sporadic, focused on the hope that Keith's remains might eventually be discovered, providing at least some closure for his family. That closure never came. Keith Parkins had vanished from flat, open terrain in less than 30 seconds, leaving behind only a set of footprints that ended in the middle of nowhere, as if he had simply ceased to exist mid-step. One of the most counterintuitive patterns in these disappearances is the weather. Conventional logic suggests people would be more likely to get lost or injured during storms, heavy fog, or blizzards. Yet the data shows the opposite. An overwhelming majority of the vanishings occurred during mild, clear weather with excellent visibility. Dennis Martin disappeared on a sunny June day. Keith Parkins vanished under cloudless September skies. Aaron Hedges, who disappeared in the crazy mountains of Montana, was last seen on a calm, warm afternoon. This pattern extends across hundreds of cases, suggesting that whatever is causing these disappearances, it isn't simply people getting disoriented by poor conditions. When Paulides analysed weather data for the dates and locations of disappearances, the pattern became statistically significant. Approximately 78% of the cases occurred during weather conditions rated as good or excellent: clear skies, moderate temperatures, light winds, and visibility exceeding several kilometers. Only 12% occurred during what could be classified as poor weather, and even those cases often involved conditions that were merely overcast rather than genuinely dangerous. The remaining cases had mixed or uncertain weather data. The temperature data showed similar patterns. Most disappearances occurred when conditions were neither extremely hot nor dangerously cold. The median temperature at the time of disappearance was approximately 18 degrees Celsius, a comfortable hiking weather requiring no special precautions. Cases occurring in genuinely dangerous temperatures, either freezing conditions or extreme heat, were relatively rare. This ruled out weather exposure as the immediate cause in most instances. People weren't vanishing because they were caught unprepared in sudden storms or temperature drops. They were disappearing during conditions that posed minimal environmental threat. Wind patterns showed no correlation to the disappearances. Some occurred on completely calm days with no air movement. Others happened during light breezes typical of mountain environments. Strong winds that might carry away sound or create disorientation were present in less than 5% of cases. This consistency of mild conditions extended across different seasons and different geographical regions. Summer disappearances in Yosemite occurred in pleasant weather. Fall cases in the Smokies happened during mild autumn days. Spring incidents in the Rockies took place under clear skies, with moderate temperatures. What made this pattern particularly puzzling was its contradiction to normal search and rescue statistics. In typical wilderness emergencies, weather is often a contributing factor. Hikers get caught in unexpected storms, lose visibility in fog, or become hypothermic in sudden cold snaps. But the missing 411 cases showed the opposite trend. When conditions should have been safest, when visibility was excellent and temperatures were comfortable, people vanished at the highest rates. It was as if the good weather somehow made these events more likely rather than less, though no researcher could propose a mechanism that would explain such a correlation. The weather anomaly also complicated the standard explanations for the disappearances. If people were simply getting lost due to poor navigation or disorientation, you would expect more cases during fog, storms, or other conditions that impair judgment and visibility. If hypothermia were causing the paradoxical undressing and erratic behavior seen in some cases, you would expect colder temperatures. If heat stroke were a factor, you would expect higher temperatures. Instead, the cases clustered around moderate, pleasant conditions that should have been ideal for safe wilderness travel. Whatever was happening, it wasn't weather-dependent in any conventional sense. Search and rescue teams rely heavily on trained tracking dogs, animals capable of following a human scent across miles of wilderness. In normal missing persons cases, dogs can track someone even days after they've passed through an area. But in these park disappearances, something different happens. Time and again, dogs would follow a scent trail with confidence, sometimes for hundreds of meters, then suddenly stop. Handlers describe the dogs becoming confused or agitated, circling the same spot repeatedly before sitting down, indicating the trail had ended. Not faded, ended, as if the person they were tracking had simply ceased to exist at that exact location. This behavior was reported in the searches for Dennis Martin, DeOrr Kunz, Jaryd Atadero, and dozens of others. The consistency of this behavior, across different dogs, different handlers, and different cases, made it particularly significant. These weren't inexperienced animals or poorly trained handlers making mistakes. The dogs used in these searches were often certified by multiple agencies, with proven records of successful finds in challenging conditions. Some had located missing persons in dense forest. Others had tracked suspects across urban environments. They were professionals at the peak of their capabilities, handled by experts who understood their behavior intimately. In Dennis Martin's case, multiple bloodhounds from different agencies were used over several days, each dog, working independently without knowledge of where previous dogs had tracked, followed essentially the same path. They picked up Dennis's scent at the point where he was last seen, followed it along the trail for approximately 15 meters past where his father had watched him jog out of sight, then stopped at nearly identical locations. The handlers reported the dogs showing classic termination behavior. Intensive sniffing in a small area, circling, whining, and finally sitting, the trained signal that the scent trail had ended. What made this particularly unusual was that scent trails don't normally end this way. In typical tracking scenarios, a scent gradually fades as it disperses in the air or gets degraded by weather and time. Dogs will show decreasing confidence, ranging more widely as they try to reacquire the scent, eventually losing it altogether as it becomes too faint to detect. But in these cases, the dogs went from confidently following a strong scent to complete loss in a matter of meters. It was as if the person had been there, leaving normal scent markers, then abruptly stopped producing any scent at all. Handlers considered every possible explanation. Had the person been picked up by a vehicle? Unlikely in Dennis Martin's case, as the location was on a hiking trail inaccessible to vehicles. Had they entered water, which can disperse scent? In some cases, yes, but in others, the termination points were on dry land far from water sources. Had they been carried by another person? This should still produce some scent trail from the carrier, and in the case of small children being carried, should actually concentrate the child's scent at a higher elevation where dogs could still detect it. Some handlers theorized about unusual wind patterns or atmospheric conditions that might carry scent away unusually quickly. But these cases occurred in various weather conditions: calm days, breezy days, different temperatures, and humidity levels. The terminated trails appeared regardless of meteorological factors. Other handlers wondered about terrain features that might create scent traps or unusual air currents. Yet the terminations occurred on flat ground, on slopes, in valleys, and on ridges no consistent terrain pattern emerged. The dog's behavior remained the most troubling mystery in cases already filled with inexplicable elements. On October 2nd, 1999, 3-year-old Jaryd Atadero vanished while hiking with a Christian singles group on the Big South Trail in Colorado's Poudre Canyon. Jaryd had been walking near the front of the group when he apparently continued ahead on the trail while the adults stopped to rest. When they realized he was missing, searchers immediately flooded the area. What they found 4 years later was deeply troubling. Jaryd's remains were discovered on a steep mountainside, in an area that had been searched multiple times. His clothing was neatly arranged, not torn or scattered as would be expected from animal predation or a fall. Most disturbing was the location itself. Experienced mountaineers said a 3-year-old could not have physically climbed to that spot alone. The terrain was too technical, too steep, and too far from where he was last seen. The Big South Trail where Jaryd disappeared was a moderate hiking path, well maintained and clearly marked. The Christian singles group had brought several children on the hike, and Jaryd, an energetic and outgoing child, had been enjoying himself. When the group stopped for a water break approximately 2 miles into the hike, Jaryd apparently didn't stop with them. One of the adults reported seeing him continue up the trail, walking at a normal pace, not running or showing signs of distress. This sighting was the last confirmed observation of Jaryd alive. The initial search began within an hour of Jaryd being reported missing. Search teams worked the trail systematically, calling his name, checking side paths and off-trail areas where a curious child might wander. By evening, over 100 searchers were involved. The effort expanded over the following days to include helicopters, tracking dogs, and technical climbing teams to check areas that seemed beyond a child's reach. The searches continued intensively for 2 weeks, then periodically for months afterward. No trace of Jaryd was found during any of these efforts. 4 years later, in June 2003, hikers discovered a small shoe on a steep slope, approximately 550 meters from where Jaryd had last been seen. Search teams immediately returned to the area and located Jaryd's remains on a mountainside that had been searched multiple times during the initial effort. The location was striking for several reasons. First, the slope was extremely steep, approximately 40 degrees in angle, covered with loose rock and unstable soil. Second, the elevation was about 150 meters higher than the trail where Jaryd was last seen. Third, there was no direct route from the trail to this location that didn't involve technical climbing over dangerous terrain. Experienced mountaineers brought in to assess the site were unanimous in their conclusion. A 3-year-old child could not have reached this location unassisted. The approach from any direction required navigating Class 3 or Class 4 terrain technical scrambling that demanded good judgment, strength, and reach beyond a toddler's capabilities. The slope where the remains were found was unstable enough that adult searchers had difficulty maintaining footing. The idea that Jaryd had somehow climbed there alone, in the dark, as he would have been by the time he could have reached the area, without falling or crying out, seemed physically impossible. The condition of the remains and clothing added more questions. Jaryd's clothes were present, but laid out in a way that seemed organized rather than scattered. There was no evidence of the extensive damage that would be expected if he had fallen down the steep slope or been attacked by the mountain lions that inhabited the area. The bones showed no signs of animal gnawing or predation damage. The scene didn't match any normal scenario. Not a fall, not an animal attack, not exposure in place. It looked, several investigators noted, as if Jaryd had been placed there, though no theory could explain who would do such a thing or why. In a handful of cases, missing persons are eventually found in locations that were thoroughly searched multiple times. The body of Geraldine Largay, who vanished on the Appalachian Trail in 2013, was discovered just 2 years later, only 3,000 feet from the trail, in an area that had been extensively searched by trained teams with dogs. The same pattern appeared in the case of Charles McCullough, who disappeared in Crater Lake National Park. His remains turned up in a location searchers had combed through repeatedly during the initial search. This reverse vanishing suggests either the bodies are being moved after searches conclude, or they somehow weren't present when the searches occurred, appearing later in already cleared areas. The Geraldine Largay case was particularly well documented due to the intensive search effort and the subsequent discovery. Largay, an experienced hiker attempting a solo through hike of the Appalachian Trail, left the trail on July 22, 2013, to use the bathroom. She became disoriented in the dense forest and couldn't relocate the trail. Over the following days, she attempted to signal for help, sent text messages that failed to transmit due to lack of cell service, and eventually succumbed to exposure and lack of food. Her remains were found in October 2015 by a surveyor who happened to be working in the area. What made the discovery troubling was the proximity to the trail and the intensity of the initial search. Largay's body was located approximately 900 meters from the Appalachian Trail, in terrain that search teams had covered multiple times with dogs, aircraft, and ground personnel. The search had been one of the largest in Maine's history, involving hundreds of volunteers and professional teams over several weeks. Thermal imaging from helicopters had scanned the area. Dogs had been worked through the forest repeatedly. Ground teams had walked grid patterns through the exact region where she was eventually found. The case of Charles McCullough showed similar patterns. McCullough disappeared while hiking in Crater Lake National Park in 1974. Despite immediate searches involving park rangers and volunteers, no trace of him was found. 2 years later, hikers discovered his remains in an area that had been searched thoroughly during the initial effort. The location was close to established trails, in terrain that offered no particular concealment. Search reports from 1,974 specifically documented teams covering that area multiple times, yet McCullough's body wasn't there to be found until 1976. This pattern appeared in enough cases to rule out isolated instances of searchers simply missing something obvious. In the case of John Donovan, who disappeared in Yosemite in 2010, his remains were found 3 years later in an area that had been searched by multiple teams, including technical climbers who had specifically accessed the location where his body eventually appeared. The search coordinator who had led the initial effort examined photographs of the discovery site and confirmed it was an area they had visually inspected during the original search. Yet Donovan's remains showed no evidence of having been moved or disturbed after death. No drag marks, no scattered bones, no indication of animal relocation. The reverse disappearance pattern raised deeply uncomfortable questions. If the bodies weren't present during initial searches, where were they? Were they somehow removed and later returned? The logistics of such an operation seemed impossible. Who would do such a thing? And how could they avoid leaving evidence of their presence? Were the bodies present, but somehow concealed or overlooked, only to become visible later through natural processes? This seemed unlikely, given the professionalism of the search teams and the repeated coverage of the same areas. Or was something stranger happening? Something that allowed people or their remains to be absent from locations and then present again, with no conventional explanation bridging the gap. A statistically improbable number of these cases occur near boulder fields, chaotic landscapes of massive house-sized rocks scattered across mountainsides or valleys. These geological features create natural mazes, with countless hidden spaces between the stones. Several missing children were last seen near or approaching boulder fields moments before vanishing. When searchers investigated these areas, they often found the spaces between boulders too tight, too deep, or too unstable for a small child to navigate. Yet the scent trails led directly into these stone labyrinths before stopping. Some researchers have theorized these geological formations might create unusual electromagnetic conditions, though no conclusive evidence has supported this hypothesis. Boulder fields form through geological processes spanning thousands of years. Massive stones break away from cliff faces through freeze-thaw cycles, tumbling downslope to create jumbled accumulations of rock. The spaces between these boulders can extend deep underground, forming natural caves and passages that are unmapped and potentially unstable. In theory, a person could fall into such a space and become trapped beyond recovery. But the cases associated with boulder fields don't fit this straightforward explanation. In Rocky Mountain National Park, 3 separate disappearances occurred near a specific boulder field over a span of 20 years. The victims were different ages and hiking under different circumstances, but all were last seen approaching or near the same geological feature. Search teams explored the boulder field extensively after each incident, sending technical climbers into the deeper spaces between rocks, using cameras on poles to examine areas too tight for human entry. They found no remains, no clothing, no evidence that anyone had fallen into the spaces below. The rocks themselves showed no blood, no fabric tears, nothing to suggest recent human contact. The boulder field pattern appeared in multiple parks. Mount Rainier had 2 cases associated with boulder fields on the mountain's lower slopes. Crater Lake showed 3 disappearances near rocky areas, characterized by large, scattered stones. The Adirondacks in New York had several cases clustering around boulder-heavy terrain. When Paulides mapped these cases, the correlation between boulder fields and disappearances was strong enough to be statistically significant, appearing far more often than random distribution would predict. What made the boulder field connection particularly strange was the behavior of search dogs in these areas. Multiple handlers reported that their dogs would track a scent to the edge of a boulder field, then stop, refusing to enter the rocky terrain. The dogs would circle the perimeter, whining and showing signs of distress or confusion, but wouldn't proceed into the boulders even when encouraged. This behavior was unusual, because trained search dogs normally don't hesitate to enter difficult terrain if they're following a scent. Handlers reported that the dogs seemed disturbed by something about the boulder fields themselves, independent of the scent trail they were following. Geologists consulted on some of these cases noted that boulder fields can create unusual acoustic properties, with sounds echoing strangely or being absorbed completely depending on the specific rock arrangement. They also confirmed that certain rock types, particularly those high in quartz content, can generate weak electromagnetic fields through piezoelectric effects when under stress. Whether these physical properties could somehow contribute to the disappearances remained pure speculation. No mechanism was proposed that could explain how electromagnetic fields or acoustic anomalies would cause people to vanish without trace. The boulder fields remained a consistent element in the pattern, appearing too frequently to dismiss as coincidence, yet offering no clear explanation for their role. They were locations where people approached and disappeared, where search dogs refused to enter, where massive efforts found nothing. Like so many elements in these cases, the boulder field connection raised more questions than it answered. Vanished from a campsite. On July 10, 2015, 2-year-old DeOrr Kunz Jr. disappeared from a campsite at Timber Creek Campground in Idaho. His parents, grandfather, and a family friend were all present at the small site when DeOrr vanished between the time his mother walked to the creek and returned, a span of approximately 12 minutes. The campground was remote but compact, surrounded by open terrain that would make it nearly impossible for a toddler to wander far unnoticed. Search teams arrived quickly and deployed every available resource: dogs, helicopters, ground teams, and divers for the nearby reservoir. Despite an exhaustive search covering over 2.5 square miles and involving hundreds of personnel, not a single trace of DeOrr was ever found. No clothing, no footprints, no physical evidence of any kind. 8 years later, his disappearance remains completely unexplained. The Timber Creek Campground where DeOrr vanished was a small, primitive site along a creek in the Lemhi County wilderness. The campsite itself covered an area of perhaps 50 by 50 meters, with the family's vehicles, tents, and camping equipment arranged in clear view of each other. When DeOrr's mother, Jessica Mitchell, walked the short distance to the creek to clean up, She left DeOrr with his father, grandfather, and the grandfather's friend. The 4 adults were all within the immediate campsite area. Jessica was gone for what she later estimated as 10 to 12 minutes. When she returned, DeOrr was missing. The initial search began immediately, with the family members spreading out to check the immediate area. They called DeOrr's name, looked behind the vehicles and camping equipment, walked the creek bank looking for any sign he might have wandered toward the water. When these immediate efforts found nothing, they drove to a location with cell service and called 911. By late afternoon, search and rescue teams from multiple agencies had converged on the campsite. The rapid response was textbook searchers were on scene within hours, while DeOrr's scent would still be fresh, and any tracks would remain undisturbed. The search that followed was exhaustive. Bloodhounds tracked scent around the immediate campsite, but couldn't establish a clear trail leading away. The dogs showed confusion, circling the area repeatedly, but never indicating a definite direction of travel. Ground teams worked outward in expanding circles, searching every cluster of sagebrush, every depression in the terrain, every possible space where a small child might have crawled or hidden. The nearby creek was searched meter by meter, with divers checking deeper pools despite the water's clarity making concealment unlikely. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew grid patterns over the area for several days. The high desert terrain offered little concealment. Sparse vegetation, open ground, clear sightlines. If DeOrr had wandered away from camp, even a significant distance, the thermal cameras should have detected his body heat. They found nothing. Ground teams expanded the search radius to over 2 miles, covering terrain that would have taken a toddler hours to reach. They checked every abandoned structure, every natural shelter, every mine shaft in the region. The search involved over 200 personnel at its peak, including FBI agents, local law enforcement, volunteer search teams, and wilderness rescue specialists. As days passed with no results, investigators began considering alternative scenarios. Had DeOrr been abducted? The campsite's remoteness made this seem unlikely. It wasn't near any roads where someone could quickly flee, and the adults present would likely have noticed a stranger approaching. Had he fallen into the creek and been swept away? Divers and ground teams thoroughly searched downstream for miles, finding no evidence. Had an animal taken him? No tracks, no blood, no disturbed ground suggested predator involvement, and such an attack within meters of 4 adults seemed implausible. The case eventually became complicated by inconsistencies in witness statements and suspicions of family involvement. But these investigative angles never produced evidence explaining DeOrr's physical disappearance. Regardless of what happened in terms of human responsibility, the physical question remained. How does a 2-year-old vanish from a small campsite, in open terrain, within a 12-minute window, leaving absolutely no trace despite immediate and intensive searching? The case fit the missing 411 profile perfectly. Young child, rapid disappearance, open terrain, massive search, finding nothing. Statistical analysis of these wilderness disappearances reveals a troubling age-related pattern. Children between the ages of 2 and 6 represent a disproportionately high percentage of the cases, far exceeding what random chance would predict. This demographic is particularly vulnerable, old enough to wander, but too young to understand danger or navigate back. Yet the circumstances of their disappearances suggest something beyond simple wandering. Many vanished while adults were within sight or earshot, during brief moments of distraction lasting less than a minute. The speed and totality of these disappearances defies normal explanations of a child simply walking away and getting lost. Something about this specific age group appears to be a common factor, though researchers have yet to identify why. When Paulides analysed the age distribution across hundreds of cases, the pattern was striking. Children aged 2 to 6 accounted for approximately 41% of all wilderness disappearances, meeting the missing 411 criteria, despite this age group representing less than 8% of park visitors. The overrepresentation was mathematically significant, occurring at rates roughly 5 times higher than their proportion of the visiting population would predict. This wasn't a subtle trend that could be explained by reporting bias or heightened concern about missing children. It was a pronounced spike in a specific age range. The pattern held consistent across different geographical regions and different time periods. Cases from the 1950 seconds showed the same age concentration as cases from the 2000s. Disappearances in Yosemite matched the age profile of those in the Smokies, the Rockies, and the Pacific Northwest. Whether the park was heavily visited or remote, whether the terrain was mountainous or relatively flat, the age distribution remained remarkably consistent. Children in this 2 to 6 age range were vanishing at rates that demanded explanation. Conventional theories struggle to account for the specificity. Yes, young children are more likely to wander off and get lost than older children or adults. But that tendency alone shouldn't create such a pronounced spike in a narrow age range. Children under 2 rarely have the mobility to wander far, which might explain why they appear less frequently. But why do the cases drop off so sharply after age 6? Children aged 7, 8, and 9 can still get lost in wilderness areas, yet they appear in these mysterious disappearance cases at much lower rates. The speed of the disappearances also defied simple wandering explanations. Dennis Martin was 6 when he vanished in under 10 seconds. Keith Parkins was 2 when he disappeared in under 30 seconds. DeOrr Kunz was 2 when he vanished within a 12-minute window from a compact campsite. These weren't cases of children gradually wandering away over hours until they were too far to find. They were rapid, complete vanishings that suggested something happening in the immediate moment, not a gradual process. Some researchers proposed that young children in this age range might be more likely to follow animals or be curious about novel stimuli, leading them quickly away from safety. But this theory required the children to move at speeds beyond their physical capabilities to reach the distances where searches found no evidence. It also didn't explain the terminated scent trails or the complete absence of footprints and physical evidence. A child distracted by a deer or a butterfly would still leave tracks, would still produce scent, and would eventually be found by the massive search efforts that followed these disappearances. The age pattern remained one of the most consistent and inexplicable elements in the data. Whatever was causing these disappearances, it showed a clear preference if that word could be applied for children in a specific developmental window. Whether this related to their behavior, their size, their cognitive state, or something else entirely, no researcher had successfully identified. The pattern was clear and statistically undeniable, yet its meaning remained hidden. While young children make up one cluster, another distinct group also vanishes at unusual rates: experienced outdoorsmen and women with extensive wilderness knowledge. These are not novices who underestimate nature or ignore warning signs. They are hunters, hikers, and outdoors enthusiasts who understand the terrain, carry proper equipment, and know how to signal for help. Yet they disappear just as completely as the children, often in areas they knew well. The case of Hedges, a seasoned hunter who vanished in Montana's Crazy Mountains, exemplifies this pattern. Hedges knew the area intimately, carried survival gear, and was an expert tracker himself. His disappearance in broad daylight, during good weather, from terrain he could navigate blindfolded, has never been explained. The experienced hiker pattern appeared with disturbing frequency in Pauladiz's research. Individuals with decades of wilderness experience, professional guides, survival instructors, and backcountry rangers numbered among the missing. These were people who had spent thousands of hours in remote areas, who understood weather patterns, navigation techniques, and survival strategies. They weren't making rookie mistakes, yet they vanished under circumstances that suggested they either became instantly incapacitated or encountered something completely outside their experience base. Hedges disappeared in September 2014 during a solo hunting trip in Montana's Crazy Mountains. At 38 years old, Hedges was an experienced outdoorsman who had hunted the Crazes since childhood. He knew the terrain, the weather patterns, and the potential hazards. He carried appropriate gear including GPS, communication devices, survival supplies, and weapons. When he failed to return as scheduled, search teams found his campsite intact, his truck parked where he'd left it, and no indication of where he had gone or why. The search for Hedges covered over 30 square miles of terrain he knew intimately. Helicopters, ground teams, and tracking dogs worked the area for weeks. The Crazy Mountains have a reputation among locals as a place where strange things happen, where people go missing with unusual frequency. Some attribute this to the difficult terrain and unpredictable weather, but Hedges knew these dangers and was equipped to handle them. His disappearance fit no conventional scenario. He didn't fall, no body was found at the base of cliffs. He wasn't attacked by animals, no signs of struggle appeared anywhere. He didn't get lost, he could navigate these mountains in the dark. Similar cases appeared across the country. Thomas Messick, an experienced hiker and survival instructor, vanished in the Adirondacks in 2015, despite extensive knowledge of the area and proper equipment. Mike Heron, a professional guide, disappeared in the Great Smoky Mountains. Under clear conditions, in terrain he had guided others through hundreds of times. George Penker, a skilled outdoorsman, vanished in Yosemite despite decades of backcountry experience. In each case, the victims' expertise made their disappearances more baffling rather than less. The pattern suggested that wilderness experience offered no protection against whatever was causing these events. If anything, the frequency with which experienced outdoorsmen vanished implied that time spent in remote areas might increase exposure to the phenomenon rather than reduce risk through greater knowledge and skill. This ran counter to every logical expectation. Experience should reduce risk. Knowledge should provide protection. Proper equipment and training should prevent disaster. Yet here were expert woodsmen, professional guides, and survival specialists vanishing as completely and mysteriously as toddlers who wandered away from campsites. The experienced hiker pattern also undermined conventional explanations. These weren't people who panicked and made poor decisions. They weren't ill-equipped or unprepared. They weren't lost in any normal sense. Many disappeared from areas they could navigate unconsciously. Whatever happened to them occurred despite their experience, despite their preparation, despite their knowledge. It suggested that the phenomenon they encountered was so far outside normal wilderness hazards that conventional skills and experience provided no defense. In a subset of cases where bodies are eventually recovered, investigators have noted a bizarre detail. The victim is found without shoes, even though they were wearing them when they disappeared. This pattern has appeared so frequently that search and rescue teams have begun specifically looking for discarded footwear. What makes this particularly strange is the condition of the victim's feet. Often, there are no signs of the severe injuries you would expect from someone walking barefoot through rough wilderness terrain. The shoes aren't found along the path, suggesting they weren't simply lost while walking. In several cases, the shoes were later discovered neatly placed together, far from the body, as if deliberately removed and set aside. No conventional explanation accounts for this behavior, especially in cases involving young children or people found deceased. The missing shoes pattern appeared in enough cases to constitute a genuine statistical anomaly. In approximately 30% of cases where bodies were eventually recovered, the victims were found partially or completely barefoot, despite having worn boots or shoes when they disappeared. The removed footwear was sometimes found nearby, sometimes discovered far from the body, and sometimes never located at all. The consistency of this detail across unrelated cases, different age groups, and various geographical locations suggested it was more than coincidence. In the case of Jaryd Atadero, searchers who found his remains 4 years after his disappearance noted that one of his shoes was located approximately 150 meters from where his body was discovered, while the other shoe was found in yet another location. Both shoes were in areas that had been searched during the initial effort. They appeared to have been removed and placed, rather than lost during panicked movement through difficult terrain. Jaryd's feet, what remained after 4 years of exposure, showed no obvious signs of the severe trauma that walking barefoot over the rocky terrain should have produced. Katherine van Alst, the 6-year-old found alive after 4 days missing in Gettysburg, was discovered barefoot despite wearing boots when she disappeared. The boots were never found. Katherine's feet showed surprisingly minimal damage considering she had supposedly wandered for days through rocky, forested terrain. When questioned about the boots, Katherine couldn't explain what had happened to them or why she had removed them. Similar cases appeared in the records with troubling frequency. The pattern became more disturbing when it appeared in cases of adults found deceased. They were experienced hikers who vanished and were later found without footwear. In some instances, the shoes were discovered neatly placed together at a location the victim couldn't have logically reached before death. The arrangement suggested deliberate removal and careful placement, behavior that made no sense given the circumstances. Medical examiners who had worked on these cases noted the inconsistency between the missing shoes and the condition of the feet. Walking any significant distance barefoot through wilderness terrain produces distinctive injuries. Cuts, bruises, embedded thorns or stones, severe abrasions on the soles and sides of the feet. Yet bodies found without shoes often showed minimal foot trauma. Either they hadn't walked far without their shoes, which raised the question of why and where they removed them, or something about the environment or circumstances prevented the expected injuries from occurring. The paradoxical undressing phenomenon associated with hypothermia offered one possible explanation. In late-stage hypothermia, victims sometimes experience a sensation of burning heat and begin removing clothing, including shoes, but this explanation failed in several ways. First, many of these cases occurred in moderate weather, where hypothermia seemed unlikely. Second, hypothermic undressing typically happens in the final stages before death, yet some victims found without shoes showed no other signs of hypothermia. Third, it didn't explain why shoes were sometimes found carefully placed rather than scattered, or why they appeared in locations separate from other discarded clothing. The missing shoes remained another thread in the pattern, another detail that appeared too consistently to dismiss, yet offered no clear pathway to explanation. Like the terminated scent trails, the boulder field connections, and the age distributions, it was a piece of a puzzle that refused to form a coherent picture. The Great Smoky Mountains show 11 unexplained vanishings in a relatively small area. Yosemite has 16 cases, clustered in particular regions of the park. Mount Shasta in California has its own troubling concentration. These aren't the most visited areas, nor are they the most dangerous terrain. Some of the densest clusters occur in moderate, well-traveled sections of parks. Statistical analysis suggests these clustering patterns occur at rates far beyond chance, pointing to some localized factor that researchers have yet to identify. Whether geological, electromagnetic, or something else entirely, certain places appear to be more prone to these events. The mathematical analysis of these clusters revealed patterns that were statistically significant beyond any reasonable doubt. Using standard geographical clustering algorithms, researchers calculated that the probability of these concentrations occurring by random chance was less than 0.001%. The cases weren't just somewhat grouped, they were tightly concentrated in ways that demanded explanation. In the Great Smoky Mountains, the 11 cases that met the missing 411 criteria occurred primarily in 3 distinct zones. One cluster centered around Klingman's Dome, the highest peak in the park at 2,025 meters elevation. 4 disappearances had occurred within a 3-mile radius of the summit over a span of 35 years. The victims ranged from a 4-year-old child to a 6-7-year-old experienced hiker. They vanished in different seasons, under different circumstances, yet all within this tight geographical area. The second Smokies cluster appeared in the Cades Cove region, a broad valley surrounded by mountains. 3 cases over 40 years, all involving people who were last seen near the valley floor or the surrounding ridges. The third concentration was in the remote backcountry near the Appalachian Trail, where 4 hikers had vanished despite the trail being well marked and regularly traveled. Each cluster represented an area that received thousands of visitors annually, yet only these specific locations showed the unusual disappearance patterns. Yosemite's clusters showed even tighter precision. When plotted on large-scale topographic maps with coordinates derived from search reports, the 16 cases formed 3 primary groupings with remarkable spatial accuracy. The high country cluster near Tuolumne Meadows showed 5 cases occurring within a 400-meter radius. This wasn't a large area you could walk across it in 5 minutes. Yet over 4 decades, 5 people had vanished from this specific spot while the surrounding wilderness, covering hundreds of square miles of similar terrain, showed no unusual disappearance rates. Mount Shasta presented perhaps the most geographically precise cluster, 7 cases over 50 years, all occurring on the mountain's southern and western slopes between 1,800 and 2,400 meters elevation. The clustering was so tight that all 7 disappearances fell within a 2-mile radius. The mountain's northern and eastern slopes, with similar terrain and comparable visitor traffic, showed no mysterious disappearances during the same period. Researchers examined every possible explanation for these geographical patterns. Was it visitor traffic? No, some heavily visited areas showed no clusters, while some remote areas did. Was it terrain difficulty? No clusters appeared in both challenging and moderate terrain. Was it proximity to roads or trailheads? No consistent pattern emerged. Was it elevation? The clusters ranged from near sea level to above 3,000 meters. Was it vegetation type? Clusters appeared in desert scrubland, dense forest, and above the tree line. The geographical precision of these clusters suggested that location itself was a critical factor. Something about these specific places, these exact coordinates, correlated with the disappearances, whether that something was geological composition, electromagnetic properties, geographical features that created unusual atmospheric conditions, or something else entirely, remained unknown. But the clustering was undeniable, repeating across different parks, different states, different decades, with mathematical consistency that ruled out coincidence. The girl who vanished on horseback. On July 17, 1981, 4-year-old Stacy Arras was riding her horse with her father in Yosemite National Park, taking photographs of the scenery. When her father rode ahead briefly, Stacy stayed behind at Sunrise High Sierra Camp to snap a few more pictures. Her father was gone for less than 15 minutes. When he returned, Stacy, her horse, and her camera were gone. An immediate search found her horse and camera quickly, but Stacy had vanished. The search effort swelled to massive proportions over the following weeks, covering an area of over 100 square miles. Bloodhounds tracked her scent to a specific point, then lost it completely. Despite the intensity of the search and the quick response time, not a single trace of Stacy Arras has ever been found. Her case remains one of Yosemite's most baffling disappearances. Stacy was an experienced rider, comfortable on horseback, and familiar with outdoor recreation. She and her father had been enjoying a pleasant ride through Yosemite's high country, an area of stunning natural beauty characterized by granite domes, alpine meadows, and clear mountain air. The Sunrise High Sierra Camp where Stacy stopped was a developed area with cabins and facilities, not remote wilderness. Other visitors were in the vicinity, and the trail system was well established and clearly marked. When her father returned from his brief ride ahead and found Stacy missing, he immediately began searching the immediate area. He found her horse grazing near the trail, still saddled, showing no signs of distress or panic. Stacy's camera was on the ground nearby, suggesting she had been taking photographs when something interrupted her. But Stacy herself was nowhere to be seen. Her father alerted camp personnel, and within an hour, organized search efforts were underway. The search that followed was one of Yosemite's most intensive efforts of the early 1980 seconds. Over 150 personnel participated at the peak, including park rangers, volunteer search teams, tracking dog units, and helicopter crews. The high country terrain was challenging but not impossibly difficult. Experienced searchers could cover ground systematically. The weather remained clear throughout the initial search period, providing ideal conditions for both ground and air operations. Bloodhounds brought to the scene picked up Stacy's scent and followed it from where her horse and camera were found. The dogs tracked with apparent confidence for approximately 100 meters along a faint use trail leading away from the main path. Then, in an area of open granite with scattered trees, the dogs stopped. Handlers reported the familiar pattern. The dogs circled, showed confusion, and indicated the scent trail had terminated. Multiple dogs from different agencies confirmed the same endpoint over the following days. Ground teams searched every logical area where a 4-year-old might have gone. They checked the surrounding forest, the nearby meadows, and the granite slopes where someone seeking a better photograph vantage point might have climbed. They searched areas that seemed illogical too, accounting for the possibility of disorientation or poor decision-making. Technical climbing teams checked cliff faces and steep terrain that would be dangerous but potentially accessible. Divers searched nearby streams and pools, though the water was shallow and clear enough that concealment seemed unlikely. As days became weeks, the search radius expanded to cover over 100 square miles of wilderness. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew patterns over the area during cool evening hours. Ground teams returned to previously searched areas, checking them again in case something had been missed Searchers interviewed other visitors who had been in the area that day, seeking any additional information about Stacy's movements or potential sightings. No new leads emerged. The recovery of her horse and camera so quickly made Stacy's complete disappearance even more baffling. If she had wandered off and become lost, why would she leave her horse, her means of rapid travel, and a large visible signal to searchers? If she had been abducted, how did someone approach, take her, and leave without disturbing the horse or being seen by other visitors in the area? If she had fallen or been injured, why didn't searchers find her despite covering every realistic location multiple times? 40 years later, Stacy Ann Arras remains missing, her disappearance as inexplicable as the day it occurred. Through meticulous research, certain profile points have emerged among the victims. Children with bright red or blonde hair appear at a higher frequency than their proportion in the general population would predict. Individuals with exceptionally high intelligence or advanced degrees vanish at unexpected rates. People with physical or developmental disabilities are overrepresented in the data. While these patterns could be coincidental, the statistical consistency across hundreds of unrelated cases suggests they may be relevant factors. What connects these traits, if anything, remains unknown. Some researchers have proposed these characteristics make individuals more noticeable or memorable, increasing the likelihood their cases receive attention and documentation. Others suggest something more troubling, that these traits themselves may be selection criteria for whatever is causing the disappearances. The hair color pattern was one of the first profile points Paulides identified. When he compiled physical descriptions of child victims, he found that children with red or blonde hair appeared at roughly twice the rate their proportion in the general population would predict. In the United States, naturally red hair occurs in approximately 2% of the population, yet red-headed children accounted for nearly 7% of the child disappearance cases. Blonde children showed similar overrepresentation, appearing at about 35% of cases, despite representing roughly 16% of the child population. This pattern held across different geographical regions and time periods. Cases from the 1950 seconds showed similar hair color distributions to cases from the 2000s. The pattern appeared in California cases, Smoky Mountain cases, and Rocky Mountain cases with consistent frequencies. The statistical significance was strong enough to rule out reporting bias or coincidence. Something about these hair colors correlated with the disappearances, though no mechanism could explain why hair pigmentation would be relevant. The intelligence pattern was more difficult to quantify, but appeared with notable consistency among adult victims. A disproportionate number of the missing held advanced degrees, masters, doctorates, professional certifications, requiring high cognitive ability. Others had documented exceptional abilities in mathematics, languages, or other intellectual domains. The pattern wasn't absolute. People of average intelligence also disappeared, but the frequency of highly intelligent individuals among the victims exceeded statistical expectations. Disabilities represented another clear profile point. Children with autism spectrum disorders appeared at rates far exceeding their proportion in the general population. Individuals with physical disabilities requiring mobility aids or affecting their ability to travel long distances also showed elevated representation in the cases. Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, and other developmental conditions appeared with troubling frequency among the child victims. This pattern could partially be explained by increased vulnerability. Individuals with certain disabilities might be more likely to wander or less able to signal for help, but this didn't explain why they vanished so completely, leaving no trace despite intensive searches. The profile points created an uncomfortable picture. If these characteristics were truly correlating with the disappearances, it suggested some form of selection was occurring. Random wilderness accidents shouldn't show preferences for hair color, intelligence level, or disability status. The patterns implied that something about these traits made individuals more susceptible to whatever phenomenon was causing the vanishings. Whether that susceptibility was behavioral, making people with these traits more likely to encounter dangerous situations, or something else entirely, remained unclear. Skeptics argued that the profile points reflected observer bias rather than genuine patterns. Perhaps cases involving red-headed children received more attention and documentation because they were more visually memorable. Perhaps missing persons with high intelligence or disabilities generated more thorough investigations, making their cases more likely to be included in the database. These were fair critiques, and Paulides acknowledged the difficulty of completely ruling out such biases. However, the mathematical consistency of the patterns, appearing across different researchers, different time periods, and different geographical areas, suggested the correlations were real. The most troubling aspect of the profile points was their specificity. These weren't broad categories that could encompass most missing persons. They were narrow traits that appeared with surprising frequency in a subset of particularly mysterious cases. Whatever they meant, whatever role they played in the phenomenon, the profile points added another layer of pattern to disappearances that already defied conventional explanation. Most disappear in afternoon hours. Analysis of the precise times these vanishings occur reveals another pattern. The majority happen between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. This window represents the warmest, brightest part of the day, when visibility is at its peak and the most people are out on trails. It's the time when you would least expect someone to get lost or encounter danger without being noticed. Yet this is when they disappear most frequently. Morning and evening disappearances are comparatively rare. Nighttime cases are rarer still. The afternoon concentration is so pronounced that it can't be explained simply by more people being outdoors during those hours. Something about this specific time window appears to correlate with the vanishings, though no researcher has successfully identified what that factor might be. Paulides' analysis of documented disappearance times showed a clear statistical spike in the afternoon hours. Of the cases where specific times could be established, approximately 64% occurred between 2 p.m. and 6 p.m. Morning disappearances, from dawn until noon, accounted for roughly 21%. Evening cases, from 6 p.m. until dark, represented about 11%. Nighttime disappearances were rare, accounting for less than 4% of cases. This distribution couldn't be explained simply by visitor patterns. While more people do visit parks during afternoon hours compared to early morning, the difference isn't nearly pronounced enough to account for the disappearance concentration. Park visitor data suggests afternoon hours might see perhaps 40% more traffic than morning hours. Yet disappearances occurred at rates roughly 3 times higher in the afternoon than in the morning. The disparity pointed to something beyond simple exposure time. Dennis Martin vanished around 2:30 p.m. Stacy and Arras disappeared approximately 3 p.m. DeOrr Kunz went missing around 2:30 p.m. Jaryd Atadero was last seen at roughly 2:45 p.m. Keith Parkins vanished at approximately 3 p.m. Case after case showed disappearances occurring in this 4-hour afternoon window. The consistency was striking, appearing across different decades, different parks, different victim profiles. The afternoon timing raised questions about environmental factors that might be specific to those hours. Solar radiation reaches its peak in afternoon hours, creating maximum electromagnetic activity in the atmosphere. Temperature gradients between sun-exposed and shaded areas are greatest in the afternoon, potentially creating unusual air currents or acoustic effects. The angle of sunlight in afternoon hours creates different visibility conditions than morning or evening light. Whether any of these factors could somehow contribute to the disappearances remained speculative. But the time correlation was too consistent to ignore. Some researchers noted that the afternoon hours also represent a period when people are more likely to be fatigued from hours of hiking, potentially leading to lapses in judgment or supervision. Parents watching children might be less vigilant in the afternoon than in the morning when energy levels are higher. Hikers might be more focused on reaching their destination and less attentive to their surroundings. But these behavioral factors didn't explain the complete and rapid nature of the vanishings. Fatigue might contribute to someone wandering off trail, but it wouldn't explain disappeared in seconds, leaving no trace. The circadian rhythm connection was also considered. The human body's natural rhythms create different physiological states at different times of day. Afternoon hours correspond with a natural dip in alertness in many people, sometimes called the post-lunch dip. Could this reduced alertness make people more susceptible to disorientation or poor decision-making? Possibly, but again, this failed to explain the totality of the evidence, the terminated scent trails, the complete absence of physical evidence, the massive searches finding nothing. The time pattern, like so many elements in these cases, was clear and statistically significant, yet offered no obvious pathway to explanation. It was another piece of the puzzle. Another factor that appeared too consistently to dismiss as coincidence, yet its meaning remained frustratingly unclear. Trained search and rescue dogs are among the most reliable tools for finding missing persons. These animals can detect human scent across miles of wilderness, even days after someone has passed through. Yet in these park disappearances, the dogs behave in ways their handlers describe as unprecedented. In the search for Dennis Martin, dogs followed a scent trail that abruptly ended on a trail with no turnoffs, as if he had been lifted into the air. In DeOrr Kunz's case, multiple dogs independently tracked scent to the same spot near the creek, then stopped, circling in confusion. Handlers report the dogs becoming agitated or distressed at these termination points, some refusing to continue searching altogether. This behavior suggests the scent doesn't gradually fade as it normally would. It ends abruptly and completely, as if the person ceased to exist at that precise location. Search and rescue dog handlers train for years to understand their animal's behavior and interpret the signals the dogs provide. These professionals can distinguish between a dog that's lost a faint scent and needs to recast, a dog that's been distracted by wildlife, and a dog that's found the end of a trail. The behavior seen in missing 411 cases didn't fit any of these normal patterns. The dogs showed a reaction, handlers described as confusion mixed with distress, a combination rarely seen in normal search operations. In Dennis Martin's search, the first bloodhounds arrived within hours of his disappearance. The scent trail should have been fresh and strong. The dogs picked it up immediately at the point where Dennis was last seen, and followed it with clear indication of a strong scent. They moved along the trail at a steady pace, showing none of the hesitation or searching behavior that suggests a weak or contaminated trail. Then, approximately 15 meters past where Dennis's father had last seen him, the dogs stopped. They circled the area, noses to the ground, clearly searching for the continuation of the trail, but they couldn't find it. After several minutes of searching, they sat down, the trained signal that the trail has ended. The handlers worked the dogs in different patterns, approaching from different angles, trying to help them reacquire the scent if it had somehow been disrupted or carried by wind. The dogs found nothing. When fresh dogs were brought in over the following days, each one independently tracked to approximately the same spot before indicating trail termination. The consistency across multiple dogs eliminated the possibility of an individual animal having an off day or a handler misreading signals. The behavior was replicated in case after case. In Jaryd Atadero's search, dogs tracked him along the trail to a point where the path crossed a small stream, then lost the scent completely on the other side, despite checking both directions extensively. In Stacy and Arras's case, dogs followed her scent from where her horse was found to a specific spot on open granite, then stopped. In Hedges' search, dogs showed interest in the area around his campsite but couldn't establish any trail leading away from it. What made this pattern particularly significant was that it contradicted the normal physics of scent dispersal. Human scent is produced by skin cells, bacteria, and organic compounds that constantly shed from our bodies. This scent is carried by air currents, deposited on vegetation and ground surfaces, and can persist for days or even weeks depending on conditions. When a person walks through an area, they leave a scent trail that gradually diminishes over distance and time, but doesn't simply stop existing. In normal tracking scenarios, dogs lose trails in several predictable ways. The scent might be contaminated by heavy traffic from other people or animals. It might be washed away by rain or snow. It might be carried by strong winds into areas the dog can't access. It might cross water, where scent disperses differently and requires special techniques to reacquire. But in all these scenarios, the trail fades gradually, and skilled handlers can often work the dog to reacquire it. The trails in missing 411 cases didn't fade, they terminated, as if the source of the scent had simply stopped existing. Some handlers reported their dogs showing unusual stress responses at the termination points. Dogs would whine, pace, or refuse to work further in that area. A few dogs showed fear responses, tucked tails, flattened ears, reluctance to approach the spot where the scent ended. This was unusual behavior for trained search dogs. Animals selected and conditioned specifically to work in stressful wilderness environments without showing fear or distraction. 8 years old and gone in seconds. On October 14th, 2006, 8-year-old Samuel Boehlke was riding in the back of his father's truck along a dirt road in Crater Lake National Park, Oregon. His father stopped the vehicle briefly to check on something. The location offered clear sightlines for several hundred meters in all directions, with no trees or structures to provide cover. Despite an immediate search involving hundreds of volunteers and professional teams, not a trace of Samuel has ever been found. No footprints led away from the truck. No disturbances in the surrounding terrain suggested struggle. The boy had simply ceased to be there, in broad daylight, on an empty road, in the space of 2 minutes. His case remains completely unexplained, with investigators unable to even construct a plausible theory of what might have happened. The dirt road where Samuel disappeared was a remote Forest Service route, lightly travelled and surrounded by relatively open terrain. The landscape consisted of scattered pine trees, volcanic rock formations typical of the Crater Lake region, and low brush that would make it difficult for anyone, especially a child, to move through without leaving visible signs. Samuel's father had stopped the truck to examine something on the road surface, a possible obstacle or animal he wanted to avoid. He walked perhaps 10 meters ahead of the vehicle, spent less than 2 minutes investigating, and returned to find the truck's bed empty. The immediate reaction was confusion rather than alarm. Samuel's father looked around the truck, checked the cab, called his son's name. The road was straight in both directions, with visibility extending several hundred meters. If Samuel had jumped out and started walking, he would be visible. If he had run into the trees, the sound of movement through dry brush should have been audible in the quiet forest. Yet there was nothing, no sight of Samuel, no sound, no indication of which direction he might have gone. Within minutes, the father was driving to the nearest ranger station to report Samuel missing. Park rangers responded immediately, arriving back at the location within 30 minutes of the initial disappearance. They established the last known position and began systematic searches of the surrounding area. The rapid response meant Samuel's tracks should still be fresh. Any disturbed vegetation should be obvious, and if he was anywhere in the immediate vicinity, he should respond to calls. The search expanded quickly to involve over 200 personnel within the first 24 hours. Teams worked outward from the truck in careful grid patterns, checking every cluster of trees, every rock formation, every depression in the ground that might conceal a child. The terrain, while not completely flat, offered relatively good visibility. The volcanic soil in some areas should have recorded footprints clearly, yet searchers found no tracks leading away from the truck, no disturbed vegetation, no signs that anyone had passed through the area recently. Bloodhounds arrived on scene and were given Samuel's scent from clothing in the truck. The dogs showed interest in the immediate area around the vehicle, but couldn't establish a directional trail. They circled the truck repeatedly, indicating scent was present but providing no clear indication of which way Samuel had gone. Handlers tried multiple approaches, working the dogs from different starting points, but none could pick up a trail leading away from the location. Helicopters with thermal imaging surveyed the area during evening hours, when Samuel's body heat would create a strong signature against the cooling ground. They found nothing. Ground teams continued searching for days, eventually covering over 10 square miles of terrain, far more than an 8-year-old could traverse in the time before the search began. They checked every possible hazard: old mining sites, natural caves, steep ravines where someone might fall. None yielded any evidence. The case became one of Crater Lake's most baffling mysteries. The location where Samuel vanished offered no logical explanation for a rapid disappearance. The timing, less than 2 minutes, seemed impossibly short for him to travel beyond the search radius. The complete absence of tracks, disturbed vegetation, or any physical evidence suggested he hadn't walked away from the truck at all. Yet he was gone, as thoroughly and mysteriously as if he had never been there. In cases where bodies are eventually recovered, a disproportionate number are found in or near water creeks, rivers, or lakes. What makes this pattern strange is that the victims' last known positions often showed them walking away from water sources, not toward them. Additionally, many of the bodies show no signs of drowning. They're simply found in or adjacent to water in locations that were searched multiple times before. Some researchers have theorized that water may play a role in preserving or revealing remains, but this doesn't explain why the bodies weren't found during initial searches or why victims would travel to water sources in the first place. Often over difficult terrain that would require deliberate navigation, the water connection appears consistent enough to be significant. But its meaning remains unclear. The statistical analysis of body recovery locations showed water proximity in approximately 46% of cases where remains were eventually found. In many national parks, water features cover less than 5% of the total land area, yet nearly half of the recovered victims were found near water. The pattern held across different geographical regions and different types of water features. Fast-moving streams, slow creeks, lakes, and ponds all appeared in the data. What made this pattern particularly puzzling was the trajectory analysis. In numerous cases, the victim's last known position and direction of travel pointed away from water sources. Dennis Martin was last seen heading uphill, away from streams. Yet searchers theorized he might have somehow ended up in water, despite no logical path taking him there. Other cases showed similar contradictions, victims traveling in directions that would lead away from water, yet eventually found near creeks or lakes. The condition of bodies found in water added another layer of mystery. Drowning victims typically show specific physiological signs: water in the lungs, foam in the airways, distinctive patterns of lividity. Yet several of the bodies recovered from water showed no such indicators. Medical examiners determined that these individuals were already deceased when they entered the water, or died from causes other than drowning, despite being found submerged or partially submerged. This raised the question of how they ended up in water if they didn't travel there while alive and didn't drown. The search pattern complications were equally troubling. Water features are among the first areas. Search teams check when someone goes missing. Creeks are followed downstream, lakes are searched along their shores, and pools deep enough to conceal a body are probed or dived. Yet bodies that eventually turned up in or near water were often in locations that had been thoroughly searched during initial efforts. The case of a hiker found in a stream bed that had been visually inspected multiple times during the initial week of searching exemplified this pattern. Some researchers proposed that water currents might transport bodies to locations downstream from where they actually entered the water, explaining why initial searches of the entry area found nothing. This theory had merit in cases involving fast-moving rivers with strong currents, but it failed to explain cases where bodies were found in still ponds, shallow creeks with minimal flow, or upstream from their last known positions. Water transport couldn't account for bodies found in elevated positions relative to their starting point, or in water sources that didn't connect to the areas where victims disappeared. Another theory suggested that bodies might become temporarily trapped in underwater debris, root systems, or submerged vegetation, only to be released later through natural processes. This could explain some of the delayed discoveries. However, the pattern appeared in waters that were thoroughly searched by divers and probed with poles during initial efforts. Methods that should locate bodies, even if they're partially concealed by natural features. The water connection remained one of the most consistent but least understood patterns in the data. Whether water played an active role in the disappearances, served as a final destination for disoriented victims, or appeared in the pattern for some other reason entirely, no researcher had successfully determined. The correlation was clear and statistically significant, yet its meaning remained as murky as the creek waters, where too many of the missing were eventually found. When remains are eventually discovered, another troubling pattern emerges. Victims are often found partially or completely undressed, with their clothing nearby, or missing entirely, even in cases where the weather would make such behavior fatal. This phenomenon, sometimes called paradoxical undressing, is known to occur in late-stage hypothermia as victims experience a sensation of overheating. But the pattern appears in cases where hypothermia seems unlikely, based on weather conditions, season, and the victim's estimated time of survival. Young children found without clothing in moderate temperatures present a particular puzzle. The behavior doesn't match their age, the conditions, or any logical survival strategy. Yet it appears too frequently across unrelated cases to dismiss as coincidence. Paradoxical undressing in hypothermia cases is a well-documented medical phenomenon. As core body temperature drops to critical levels, the blood vessels near the skin that had been constricted to preserve heat suddenly dilate. This creates a rush of warm blood to the skin's surface, producing an intense sensation of heat despite the body actually being dangerously cold. Victims in this state often tear off clothing, believing they're overheating, which accelerates heat loss and hastens death. This explains some cases of hikers found partially clothed in cold conditions. However, the undressing pattern in missing 411 cases extended well beyond scenarios where hypothermia seemed plausible. Children found without clothing in summer temperatures around 20 degrees Celsius presented a particular paradox. At these temperatures, hypothermia would take many hours or days to develop, far longer than the typical window between disappearance and death suggested by other evidence. Why would a child remove clothing in moderate weather when no physiological mechanism would drive that behavior? The case of Jaryd Atadero exemplified this pattern. When his remains were found 4 years after his disappearance, his clothing was present but arranged in ways that suggested deliberate removal rather than tearing or scattering. The clothing wasn't shredded by animal activity or scattered by weather. It was simply removed and left behind. Jaryd had disappeared in October, when nighttime temperatures would certainly be cold enough for hypothermia. But the arrangement of his clothing didn't match the frantic tearing typically seen in paradoxical undressing. Other cases showed even stranger patterns. Some victims were found with only specific items of clothing, removed shoes and pants gone, but shirts still on, or outer layers removed while inner layers remained. This selective undressing didn't match the random, frantic behavior of hypothermic victims, or the methodical removal someone might perform in warm weather. The pattern seemed to follow no logical sequence, appearing almost arbitrary in which items were removed and which remained. In several cases involving young children, investigators noted that the clothing was found at a distance from the body, sometimes in locations the child couldn't have logically reached in their estimated condition. A 3-year-old's shoes might be found 200 meters from where the body was discovered, in terrain that would have been difficult for the child to navigate. The clothing appeared to have been removed, carried to another location, and deposited there. But this scenario raised more questions than it answered. Who would do such a thing, and why? The condition of the bodies found undressed added another troubling element. In cases where victims were found relatively quickly, the bodies often showed less environmental damage than would be expected from exposure while unclothed. Skin that should have been severely abraded from contact with rough ground or vegetation sometimes showed minimal trauma. Extremities that should have displayed advanced cold damage sometimes appeared relatively preserved. The physical evidence didn't always match what the scenario of undressed exposure would predict. Medical examiners who worked multiple cases reported frustration with the pattern. In some instances, the undressing could be explained by known medical phenomena. In others, no explanation fit the evidence. The presence of the pattern in summer disappearances, in cases involving very young children who wouldn't have the motor skills to remove complex clothing, and in scenarios where the sequence of undressing made no logical sense, all pointed to something beyond simple hypothermic confusion. The clothing paradox remained another thread in the larger mystery. Another detail that appeared too consistently to ignore, yet offered no clear pathway to understanding. Like so many elements in these cases, it was a pattern that raised more questions than it answered. Some researchers have noted that many disappearance clusters occur in areas with high granite content in the bedrock. Granite contains quartz crystals that can generate piezoelectric effects under stress, creating localized electromagnetic fields. The hypothesis suggests these fields might interfere with human cognition, navigation, or even electronic equipment, potentially creating disorientation or unusual phenomena. While intriguing, this theory struggles to explain the totality of the evidence. Electromagnetic interference might explain why people become confused or wander off trail, but it doesn't account for the complete absence of physical evidence, the abrupt termination of scent trails, or the speed at which people vanish from open terrain in clear weather while under observation. The granite connection may be one piece of a larger puzzle, but it cannot explain the entire phenomenon. The geological analysis began when researchers noticed that several major cluster areas shared similar bedrock composition. Yosemite's granite formations are famous worldwide. Massive domes and cliffs formed from plutonic rock rich in quartz, feldspar, and other crystalline minerals. The cluster areas within Yosemite often corresponded with zones of particularly dense granite exposure. Similar patterns appeared in other parks. Mount Shasta, essentially a massive volcanic mountain, showed clusters on its slopes where older granite basement rock approached the surface. Parts of the Smoky Mountains with disappearance clusters showed metamorphic rock with high quartz content. Quartz, a primary component of granite, exhibits piezoelectric properties, the ability to generate electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress. In theory, the immense geological stresses within mountain ranges could create stress on quartz-bearing rocks, generating weak electromagnetic fields. These fields would be far too weak to be directly harmful to humans, but some researchers theorized they might interfere with the subtle electromagnetic processes in the human brain, particularly those involved in spatial orientation and navigation. Laboratory studies have shown that electromagnetic fields can affect human cognition and perception under certain conditions. Strong fields near power lines or industrial equipment have been associated with reports of disorientation, headaches, and unusual sensations. Some studies suggested that even weaker fields might affect people who are particularly sensitive to electromagnetic influences. Could natural geological fields in certain areas create similar effects, disorienting hikers or causing them to make poor decisions? The theory had some appeal in explaining specific elements of the cases. If electromagnetic fields disrupted normal cognitive function, it might explain why experienced hikers got lost in familiar terrain, why people wandered away from safe areas without apparent reason, or why victims seem to make illogical navigation choices. The fields might interfere with electronic equipment like GPS units or radios, potentially explaining communication failures in some cases. However, the Granite Hypothesis failed to address the core mysteries. Electromagnetic disorientation might explain someone wandering off trail and becoming lost. It couldn't explain why they vanished in seconds while being watched. It might account for confusion and poor decision-making, but it didn't explain the terminated scent trails that suggested people simply stopped existing at specific points. It might contribute to people getting lost, but it didn't explain the complete absence of physical evidence despite massive search efforts. The hypothesis also struggled with the specificity of the pattern. Granite is one of the most common rock types on Earth's continents. Vast areas of granite-based terrain show no unusual disappearance rates. If electromagnetic fields from stressed quartz were causing the phenomenon, the pattern should appear more broadly across all granite-rich regions. Instead, the disappearances clustered in very specific locations within granite areas, suggesting that if geology played a role, it was more complex than simple rock composition. Some researchers proposed more elaborate versions of the Granite Hypothesis, suggesting that specific combinations of rock type, fault lines, underground water flow, and geological stress might create unique electromagnetic signatures in certain locations. These hotspots might produce fields of unusual strength or pattern that affected people in ways that ordinary granite didn't. This theory was more sophisticated, but also more difficult to test or verify. Measuring subtle electromagnetic variations across vast wilderness areas presented enormous technical challenges. The granite connection remained an intriguing correlation in the data, appearing frequently enough to seem potentially relevant. Whether it represented a causal factor, a coincidental geological feature of mountainous terrain where disappearances naturally concentrated, or something more complex, remained unresolved. Like many elements in the missing 411 phenomenon, it was a piece that seemed to fit into the puzzle without quite completing the picture. 4 years old, and vanished from his parents' side. On July 3, 1938, 4-year-old Alfred Beilhartz was hiking with his family in Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. The trail was wide, the weather clear, and the family was together in a group. Alfred was reportedly walking only 3 meters ahead of his parents when they momentarily looked away to navigate a tricky section of path. When they looked up seconds later, he was gone. The trail ahead was straight and clear, with good visibility for several hundred meters. There was nowhere for a small child to leave the path without being seen. Despite an immediate and extensive search, Alfred Beilhartz was never found. His case remains one of the park's oldest unsolved disappearances, and one of the clearest examples of someone vanishing from open terrain while under direct parental supervision in conditions that should have made such a disappearance impossible. The Beilhartz family had been enjoying a summer vacation in Rocky Mountain National Park, taking advantage of the clear July weather to explore the trails near their lodging. The path they were on that morning was well maintained, wide enough for people to walk comfortably side by side, and rated as easy hiking suitable for families with small children. The terrain on both sides of the trail was relatively open, scattered with trees but offering good sightlines through the forest. Alfred had been walking slightly ahead of his parents, as young children often do, eager to lead the way, but remaining close enough to be within their immediate supervision. His parents estimated he was perhaps 3 to 4 meters ahead when they encountered a section where the trail narrowed slightly around a large boulder. They looked down to watch their footing for what they later described as less than 10 seconds. When they looked up, Alfred was gone. The immediate reaction was the typical parent response, calling Alfred's name, assuming he had stepped off the trail to look at something interesting, expecting him to reappear immediately. When he didn't respond after several calls, they hurried forward, checking both sides of the trail. The path ahead was straight and visible for several hundred meters. Alfred wasn't there. The forest on either side, while containing trees and rocks, wasn't dense enough to completely conceal a child from someone standing on the trail. Yet Alfred had seemingly vanished. Within an hour, park rangers were organizing search efforts. The 1,938 search, while not equipped with modern technology, was systematic and intensive for its time. Rangers, volunteers, and other park visitors combed the area throughout the day and into the night with lanterns and flashlights. By the following morning, the search had grown to over 100 people working in coordinated teams. The terrain around the trail was searched repeatedly. Rangers checked every tree, every rock formation, every small depression where a child might have fallen or crawled. They followed the trail in both directions for miles. They searched off-trail areas in expanding circles from Alfred's last known position. The search continued for days, eventually covering several square miles of Rocky Mountain wilderness. The case predated modern search and rescue techniques. No helicopters, no thermal imaging, no trained tracking dogs in the way they're used today. Yet the searchers were experienced woodsmen and rangers who knew the terrain intimately. They understood how to track, how to search systematically, how to read signs in the forest. Their failure to find any evidence of Alfred wasn't due to lack of skill or effort. The child had simply disappeared more completely than their experience suggested was possible. The location and circumstances of Alfred's disappearance made it one of the most inexplicable cases in the missing 411 research. The open trail, the clear weather, the wide sight lines, the immediate proximity of his parents, all these factors should have made a rapid, complete disappearance impossible. A 4-year-old can't travel fast enough to move beyond sight in 10 seconds on foot. The terrain offered no concealment sufficient to hide someone from parents who were right behind them. Yet, Alfred vanished, as completely as if he had never existed, leaving behind only the mystery of those few seconds when his parents looked away. In several cases, the people who vanish aren't just experienced hikers, they're trained search and rescue personnel themselves. These are individuals who understand wilderness survival, know how to signal for help, carry proper equipment, and are familiar with the exact terrain where they disappear. The case of Jacob Gray, an experienced outdoorsman who vanished in Olympic National Park, exemplifies this. Gray knew the area well, had survival training, and carried appropriate gear, yet he vanished as completely as any of the children, his case following the same inexplicable pattern. No trace, no clues, no logical explanation. When the people who are supposed to be experts at not getting lost begin disappearing under mysterious circumstances, it suggests the phenomenon isn't simply about inexperience or poor decision-making. Jacob Gray disappeared on April 6, 2017, while bicycling on a trail in Olympic National Park, Washington. At 22 years old, Gray was an experienced cyclist and outdoorsman who knew the park's trail system well. He had informed friends of his planned route and expected return time standard safety protocol that experienced wilderness travelers follow. When he didn't return as scheduled, those who knew him became immediately concerned. Gray wasn't the type to deviate from plans without communication. The search for Gray mobilized quickly, involving park rangers, volunteer search teams, and specialized personnel. His bicycle was found on the trail, positioned normally as if he had stopped for a routine rest. His belongings were with the bike, showing no signs of disturbance or hurried departure, but Gray himself was nowhere to be found. The trail where his bike was located offered good visibility in both directions. The surrounding forest, while dense in places, wasn't impenetrable. An experienced searcher familiar with the area should have been able to navigate back to the trail easily if he'd wandered off. Search teams worked the area for weeks, covering terrain that Gray knew intimately. They checked locations he had mentioned to friends as favourite spots. They searched areas where someone might go to get a better view or take photographs. Technical teams checked hazardous areas where an accident might have occurred. Helicopters surveyed the region from above. Nothing was found, no clothing, no equipment, no signs of where Gray had gone or what had happened. What made Gray's disappearance particularly troubling to the search and rescue community was his background. This wasn't someone who panicked easily or made poor decisions in wilderness settings. He understood navigation, knew how to signal for help, and carried equipment that would allow him to survive comfortably for days if needed. If he had encountered a medical emergency or injury, he knew how to make himself visible to searchers. Yet he vanished as completely as victims, with no wilderness experience. The pattern extended to other cases involving search and rescue personnel or highly experienced outdoors people. Randy Morganson, a backcountry ranger with 28 years of experience, disappeared in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park in 2008. His remains weren't found until 2014. In an area that had been searched multiple times, his experience level, his knowledge of the terrain, his survival training, none of it prevented his mysterious disappearance. These cases struck particularly hard within the SAR community. When trained professionals vanished following the same patterns as children and inexperienced hikers, it suggested that whatever was happening operated independently of skill level or experience. Knowledge of wilderness survival, familiarity with terrain, proper equipment, none of these factors provided protection. The phenomenon, whatever it was, didn't discriminate based on competence or experience. It took the trained and untrained alike, leaving behind the same troubling absence of evidence and explanation. In nearly every case involving young children, witnesses report hearing no cries, no calls for help, no sounds of distress. This silence is particularly troubling because children who are scared, lost, or in danger typically make noise. They cry, they shout, they scream. Yet family members mere meters away hear nothing. Search teams arriving minutes later find no one responding to calls. In the case of Dennis Martin, his father heard no sound despite Dennis being only seconds out of sight. In Keith Parkins' disappearance, the open terrain should have carried any sound directly to his parents. This consistent silence across hundreds of cases suggests that either the children didn't experience fear or distress, which seems unlikely, or something prevented them from making noise, or prevented that noise from travelling normally. The acoustic evidence, or rather, the absence of it, represented one of the most consistent and troubling patterns across cases. Parents described the moments after their children vanished as unnaturally quiet. No rustling of brush indicating movement through vegetation, no small voices calling out in confusion, no cries of fear or pain that would accompany a fall or injury, just silence, complete and absolute, descending over the area like a blanket. In Dennis Martin's case, multiple family members were within earshot when he jogged ahead on the trail. The forest wasn't particularly dense at that point, and sound would have carried well in the still afternoon air. Young boys running through woods typically make noise, footsteps on leaves, branches moving, excited exclamations as they explore. Yet Dennis's father heard nothing in those crucial seconds after his son moved out of sight. The silence was so complete that it didn't initially trigger alarm. Surely if something was wrong, there would be sound. Keith Parkins vanished from flat, open terrain with his parents less than 50 meters away. The high desert environment where he disappeared carried sound well. There were no natural barriers to muffle or redirect noise. A 2-year-old child who suddenly found himself alone and couldn't see his parents would almost certainly cry out. The instinctive response of a toddler in that situation is immediate vocalization, yet his parents heard nothing. The silence was what eventually drew their attention, the realization that Keith's normal play sounds had stopped. Search teams arriving at disappearance sites within minutes or hours consistently reported the same pattern. They called the victim's name, listening carefully for any response. They worked in silence at intervals, hoping to hear cries for help or sounds of movement. In cases involving children old enough to respond to their names, no voices answered the searchers' calls. The forests remained quiet, offering no acoustic clues to guide the search. This silence extended beyond the immediate moment of disappearance. Children lost in the wilderness for hours or days typically continue calling for help periodically, especially when they hear searchers nearby. They cry from fear, cold, or hunger. They make noise moving through brush or trying to find their way back. Yet in these cases, even extended searches over multiple days found no one responding to calls, no sounds of movement, no acoustic evidence that the missing person was anywhere in the search area. The acoustic anomaly couldn't be explained by normal scenarios. A child who fell and was injured would cry from pain. A child who encountered an animal would scream in fear. A child who simply sat down and waited for help would likely call out when hearing searchers nearby. The complete silence suggested something prevented normal vocal responses. Either the children were immediately incapacitated in some way that prevented sound, or they were removed from the area so quickly and completely that their voices couldn't reach the searchers. Some researchers noted that sound travels differently in various terrain and weather conditions. Dense forest can muffle noise. Wind can carry sound away from listeners. Terrain features can create acoustic shadows where sound doesn't penetrate. However, these natural effects wouldn't account for the complete absence of sound in cases where victims vanished from open areas in calm weather. The silence was too consistent, too absolute across too many different environments to be explained by natural acoustic effects alone. On June 5, 2016, 6-year-old Katherine van Alst vanished while hiking with her family at Devil's Den in Gettysburg National Military Park, Pennsylvania. The area was crowded with visitors and relatively compact. Katherine disappeared during a brief moment when her family was regrouping on the trail. The search began immediately and grew to involve hundreds of personnel. 4 days later, Katherine was found alive, nearly 2 miles from where she vanished, at an elevation 400 feet higher than her starting point. The terrain she would have had to cross included steep, rocky slopes that experienced hikers found challenging. Katherine was barefoot when found, though she'd been wearing boots when she disappeared. She showed minimal injuries despite supposedly wandering for days through rough terrain. Her account of what happened during those 4 days was confused and fragmented, with details that didn't match the physical evidence. How a 6-year-old girl covered that distance, that elevation, across that terrain, in her condition, has never been adequately explained. Devil's Den is a rocky area within Gettysburg National Military Park, characterized by large boulder formations and uneven terrain. The Van Alst family had been hiking the relatively short trail system when Katherine disappeared. The area, while rocky, was well-traveled and compact enough that searchers initially expected to locate her quickly. When Katherine didn't respond to initial calls and quick searches of the immediate area found no sign of her, park officials mobilized a full-scale search operation. Over the next 4 days, hundreds of searchers combed the area. The search grew to include thermal imaging helicopters, tracking dogs, ground teams working in careful grids, and volunteers from multiple states. The rocky terrain was challenging but not impossibly difficult. Searchers could access most areas on foot. The search area expanded steadily as time passed, covering terrain that seemed well beyond what a 6-year-old could traverse, especially alone and in darkness. Katherine was found on the 4th day by a volunteer searcher, nearly 2 miles from her last known location. The discovery site was at a significantly higher elevation than where she had vanished, requiring a climb that would challenge adult hikers. The route from her disappearance point to where she was found would have required navigating steep, rocky slopes, crossing difficult terrain, and making navigation choices that seemed beyond a 6-year-old's capabilities. When found, Katherine was in surprisingly good condition considering the circumstances. She was dehydrated and hungry, but didn't show the severe injuries that would be expected from someone who had traveled that distance through rocky terrain. Most notably, she was barefoot, her boots were missing and never recovered. Her feet showed some damage from walking without shoes, but not the severe trauma that several miles over sharp rocks should have produced. Katherine's account of her 4 days missing was fragmentary and confused. She described being in places that didn't seem to match the geography of where she was found. She mentioned seeing things that searchers hadn't found in the area. Her timeline of events didn't align with the physical distance and terrain between her starting point and discovery location. Some details seemed impossibly vague for a child who had just experienced several days alone in the wilderness, while other details were oddly specific about things that couldn't be verified. The mystery deepened when searchers examined the route Katherine would have had to take. The terrain between her disappearance point and discovery location included sections that experienced adult hikers described as technical, requiring careful hand and foot placement, good judgment about route selection, and physical capabilities that a 6-year-old simply shouldn't possess. Several searchers familiar with the area stated flatly that they didn't believe a child Katherine's age could have navigated that terrain alone, especially in darkness, without suffering serious injuries or becoming completely stuck. The case left more questions than answers. How did Katherine cover nearly 2 miles through difficult terrain? How did she climb 400 feet in elevation across rocky slopes? Where were her boots? And when did she remove them? Why didn't she respond to searchers who had been calling her name for days, some of whom had passed within hundreds of meters of where she was eventually found? How did she survive 4 days without significant injury in terrain that should have been extremely dangerous for a child alone? Katherine Van Alst's case became another data point in the missing 411 pattern. A child who vanished suddenly, travelled impossible distances across difficult terrain, and was found in a condition that didn't match the supposed circumstances of her disappearance. One of the most frustrating aspects of researching these cases is the lack of centralized data from the National Park Service. Despite managing millions of acres where hundreds of people have vanished under mysterious circumstances, the NPS maintains no comprehensive database of missing persons incidents. Freedom of Information Act requests often yield incomplete records or heavily redacted documents. Park officials rarely discuss the cases publicly and have shown resistance to researchers attempting to compile systematic data. Some attribute this to bureaucratic inefficiency or concern about liability. Others see it as a deliberate effort to downplay the scope of the problem, to avoid public panic or damage to park visitation rates. Without complete data, it's impossible to know the true scale of the phenomenon or to identify patterns that might lead to explanations or prevention strategies. When David Paulides began his research, one of his first steps was requesting comprehensive missing persons data from the National Park Service. The response he received was surprising. The NPS informed him that no such centralized database existed. Each individual park maintained its own records in whatever format and level of detail that Parks Administration determined appropriate. There was no standardized reporting system, no central repository where all cases were documented, no way to query the entire park system for patterns or trends. This absence of centralized data was particularly striking given the NPS's meticulous record-keeping in other areas. The service maintained detailed databases of wildlife populations, tracking individual animals in some cases. They kept comprehensive records of trail conditions, campsite usage, permit applications, and visitor numbers. They documented weather patterns, geological events, and ecological changes. Yet for missing persons, a critical public safety issue, the data was scattered across individual park offices in inconsistent formats. Paulides submitted Freedom of Information Act requests to individual parks, seeking their missing persons records. The responses varied wildly. Some parks provided relatively complete information, though often with significant delays. Others returned heavily redacted documents with crucial details blacked out, citing privacy concerns or ongoing investigations. Still others claimed they couldn't locate records for cases that Paulides knew had occurred, based on newspaper reports and family accounts. The inconsistency suggested either poor record-keeping or reluctance to share information. When Paulides asked park officials why no centralized database existed, the explanations were vague. Some cited privacy laws and the sensitivity of missing persons cases. Others mentioned the difficulty of maintaining such a database across the entire park system. A few acknowledged that creating a comprehensive database might reveal patterns that could be concerning to the public or difficult to explain. None of the explanations seemed to adequately justify the absence of what should be a basic public safety resource. The resistance extended beyond data access to public discussion of the cases. Park officials rarely gave interviews about mysterious disappearances. Press releases about searches were often minimal, providing basic facts without context or follow-up information. When cases remained unsolved, they tended to fade from official communication, rather than being actively investigated or discussed. Families of missing persons sometimes reported difficulty getting updates from park officials. Once initial searches were concluded, some researchers saw this silence as evidence of a cover-up, suggesting the NPS knew more about the disappearances than they publicly acknowledged. Others attributed it to more mundane factors, liability concerns, bureaucratic inertia, or simple lack of resources to compile and maintain comprehensive records. Whatever the reason, the effect was the same. A pattern that might be visible with complete data remained hidden. Visible only to researchers willing to manually compile information from scattered sources. The lack of centralized data had practical consequences beyond research frustration. Patterns that might inform search strategies remained invisible. Families of missing persons couldn't access comprehensive information about similar cases. The public remained largely unaware of how many people had vanished in national parks under mysterious circumstances, because no central source provided that information. And why it doesn't work. One common explanation offered for child disappearances is that the children wandered off, chasing animals or picking berries, became disoriented, and succumbed to exposure before searchers could locate them. While this may account for some cases, it fails to explain the core mysteries. Children supposedly distracted by berries don't vanish in under 10 seconds from open terrain. They don't evade massive search efforts involving hundreds of trained personnel and dogs. Their bodies don't fail to appear in searched areas until years later. The berry-picking theory might explain why a child initially left the trail, but it cannot explain the complete absence of physical evidence, the terminated scent trails, or the impossibly rapid disappearances. It's a convenient explanation that addresses the least mysterious aspect of the cases, while ignoring everything that makes them truly baffling. The berry-picking explanation gained traction because it seemed to offer a rational, natural explanation for why young children might wander away from their families. Wild berries grow in many wilderness areas, often in patches that could attract a child's attention. The image of a toddler spotting bright berries, wandering toward them, and gradually getting turned around seemed plausible and non-threatening. It was the kind of explanation that allowed people to feel these were simply tragic accidents rather than something more mysterious. The theory suggested that once a child wandered off-trail pursuing berries or an interesting animal, they quickly became disoriented in the wilderness. Young children have limited understanding of navigation and might not recognize landmarks that would help them return. Fear and confusion could drive them further from the trail in random directions. Eventually, exhaustion, exposure to weather, dehydration, or hypothermia would cause them to succumb. Searchers might miss their bodies in dense vegetation, or animals might scatter remains before they could be found. This explanation worked for some wilderness disappearances, where children were missing for extended periods before searches began, where the terrain was extremely difficult or densely vegetated, or where weather conditions could plausibly prevent thorough searching. But it failed spectacularly. When applied to missing 411 cases, Dennis Martin vanished in under 10 seconds while being watched by his father. No child pursuing berries moves fast enough to travel beyond sight in 10 seconds. Keith Parkins disappeared in under 30 seconds from flat, open terrain. There were no berries visible in the immediate area, and even if there had been, a 2-year-old doesn't cover enough ground in 30 seconds to move beyond the search radius that found nothing. DeOrr Kunz vanished from a compact campsite within 12 minutes. The berry explanation couldn't account for the complete absence of any trace in such a small area searched so quickly. The scent trail terminations posed another fatal problem for the berry theory. Dogs tracking a child who wandered off pursuing berries would follow that child's scent trail along their path of travel. The trail might be erratic if the child was distracted and moving randomly, but it would continue until the child stopped moving. It wouldn't terminate abruptly in mid-path as if the child had simply ceased to exist. Yet that's exactly what the dogs found: trails that ended suddenly, completely, with no continuation in any direction. The massive search efforts that found nothing also contradicted the berry explanation. A child who wandered off and succumbed to exposure would leave a body. That body would be somewhere within the distance a child could travel before dying. Search efforts covering areas far beyond a child's possible range should find remains. Yet in case after case, searches involving hundreds of personnel, tracking dogs, helicopters, and systematic grid patterns found nothing. The berry theory couldn't explain this complete absence of evidence. The delayed discoveries posed yet another problem. When bodies were eventually found, they sometimes appeared in areas that had been thoroughly searched during initial efforts. If a child had wandered off pursuing berries and died in that location, why didn't searchers find them during the initial comprehensive search? The bury theory offered no explanation for bodies appearing years later in previously searched areas. The explanation persisted despite these failures because it was comfortable. It allowed people to believe these were simply tragic accidents, children making innocent mistakes that led to terrible consequences. It was preferable to considering alternatives that suggested something stranger might be occurring, but comfort doesn't equal accuracy, and the berry-picking theory's inability to address the core evidence made it inadequate as an explanation for the missing 411 pattern. Extended segments. The hunter who knew the mountains. In September 2014, 8-year-old Aaron Hedges vanished in Montana's Crazy Mountains while on a solo hunting trip. Hedges was an experienced outdoorsman who knew the area intimately and carried appropriate survival gear. When he failed to return as scheduled, search teams deployed quickly. They found his campsite undisturbed, his gear still in place, with no signs of struggle or departure. His truck was parked where he'd left it. Despite extensive searches covering over 30 square miles of terrain, Hedges knew by heart not a single trace of him has been found. No equipment, no clothing, no physical evidence of any kind. The Crazy Mountains have a troubling history of similar disappearances, and locals have long spoken about the range with a mixture of respect and unease. Hedges' case fits the profile precisely. Experienced outdoorsman, familiar terrain, good weather, complete vanishing. The Crazy Mountains rise dramatically from the plains of south-central Montana, a compact range of jagged peaks and deep valleys that has earned its name from both the erratic weather patterns that sweep across it and the local folklore that has accumulated over generations. The range spans roughly 30 miles north to south, with elevations reaching over 11,000 feet. Locals have long treated the Crazies with caution, speaking of strange occurrences, unexplained lights, and people who entered the mountains and never returned. Aaron Hedges knew these mountains as well as anyone. He had hunted elk and deer in the Crazies since he was a teenager, accumulating over 2 decades of experience in the range. He understood the terrain, the weather patterns, the animal behavior, and the potential hazards. He knew which drainages led where, which ridges offered the best vantage points, and which areas to avoid in bad weather. This wasn't a novice exploring unfamiliar territory. This was an expert operating in his element. When Hedges failed to return from his planned 5-day hunting trip, friends who knew his reliability and punctuality immediately contacted authorities. Search teams reached his truck at the trailhead and found everything in order. His vehicle was locked, parked in the expected location, showing no signs of disturbance. The trail from the parking area led to his campsite, which searchers located roughly 3 miles into the backcountry. The campsite appeared undisturbed, as if Hedges had simply stepped away for a short time and planned to return. His tent was properly erected and staked down. His sleeping bag was laid out inside. Food supplies were stored correctly to prevent animal access. His rifle, which no experienced hunter would leave behind when moving through bear country, leaned against a tree near the tent. The camp showed no signs of panic, struggle, or hasty departure. It looked like a hunter's camp in the middle of a normal trip, waiting for its occupant to return. Search teams worked outward from the campsite in expanding circles, following the logical areas where a hunter might travel. They checked game trails, vantage points overlooking meadows where elk might feed, and water sources where animals would congregate. Tracking dogs were brought in and given Hedges' scent from items in his tent. The dogs showed interest in the immediate camp area, but couldn't establish a clear trail leading away in any direction. The search expanded over the following weeks to cover over 30 square miles of the Crazy Mountains. Helicopters surveyed the area from above, observers looking for any sign of a person, a backpack, or disturbed ground that might indicate where Hedges had travelled. Ground teams checked every drainage, every ridgeline, every stand of timber where someone might have gone hunting or seeking shelter. Technical rescue teams investigated steep areas where a fall might have occurred. Nothing was found. The Crazy Mountains' history of disappearances added an unsettling context to Hedges' case. Local researchers documented at least 7 other unexplained vanishings in the range over the previous 60 years. Most involved experienced outdoorsmen who knew the area. All shared the same troubling characteristics. People who entered the mountains and simply never returned, despite searches finding no evidence of what had happened to them. The Crazies had earned a reputation among those who paid attention to such patterns. Hedges' disappearance became another unsolved mystery in Montana's most enigmatic mountain range. Another experienced outdoorsman who vanished completely from terrain he knew intimately, leaving behind only questions and a campsite that suggested he had intended to return. Statistical analysis reveals that individuals with physical or developmental disabilities disappear in wilderness areas at rates higher than their representation in the general population would predict. Children with autism spectrum disorders appear particularly overrepresented. Some researchers suggest these individuals may be more likely to wander or less likely to respond to searchers calling their names, which could explain delayed discovery. However, this theory doesn't account for the complete absence of physical evidence or the patterns that match cases involving non-disabled victims. The disability connection appears to be genuine, showing up consistently across hundreds of unrelated cases. What it does suggest is that vulnerable populations may be at elevated risk, though the mechanism behind that risk remains unexplained. When Paulides analysed demographic data across hundreds of cases, the disability pattern emerged with statistical significance. Children with autism spectrum disorders accounted for approximately 8% of the child disappearances in his database, despite autism affecting roughly 1 to 2% of the general child population. At the time, many of these cases occurred. The overrepresentation was roughly 4 to 8 times higher than random distribution would predict. The pattern extended beyond autism to include other developmental and physical disabilities. Children with Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, and other conditions affecting mobility or cognition appeared in the cases at elevated frequencies. Adults with physical disabilities, requiring assistive devices, also showed up more often than their proportion of wilderness visitors would suggest. The correlation was consistent enough across different geographical areas and time periods to indicate it was a genuine pattern rather than statistical noise. Some aspects of the disability connection had conventional explanations. Children with autism, particularly those with limited verbal communication, might not respond when searchers called their names. This could lead to them being overlooked even if searchers passed nearby. Some individuals with autism are drawn to water, which could explain why they might travel towards streams or lakes. Wandering behavior is more common in some populations with developmental disabilities, potentially explaining initial departure from safe areas. However, these conventional explanations fail to address the core mysteries. A child with autism who wandered away from a campsite should still leave footprints, scent trails, and physical evidence. Search dogs tracking such a child should be able to follow their path regardless of whether the child responded to calls. Yet, cases involving children with disabilities showed the same inexplicable elements as other missing 411 cases, terminated scent trails, complete absence of physical evidence, and massive searches finding nothing. The case of DeOrr Kunz, though his disability status was debated, exemplified some of these issues. At 2 years old, DeOrr was described by family members as having some developmental delays, though no formal diagnosis had been made. His disappearance from the compact campsite showed all the hallmarks of the missing 411 pattern: rapid vanishing, no physical evidence, search dogs unable to establish a clear trail. Whether his potential developmental delays played any role in his disappearance remained unclear. Bobby Bizup, a 10-year-old boy who vanished in Rocky Mountain National Park in 1958, had been at a summer camp for children with special needs. Bobby had some developmental delays that affected his communication abilities. He disappeared during a group hike. Last seen by counselors walking with the group. When they realized he was missing, he had already vanished completely. Despite immediate searches and Bobby's bright red jacket that should have been visible for long distances, he was never found. His case predated modern awareness of autism spectrum disorders, but his profile fit patterns now associated with the condition. The disability connection raised uncomfortable questions about vulnerability. If individuals with certain disabilities were genuinely at elevated risk, this information should be shared with families and caretakers to help protect vulnerable populations. Yet without understanding why the correlation existed or what mechanism was causing it, providing actionable guidance was difficult. Should families with disabled children avoid wilderness areas? That seemed an extreme response without clear causation. Should they take special precautions? Which precautions would address unknown risks? The pattern also raised questions about whether the disabilities themselves were relevant, or whether they correlated with some other factor that was the actual cause. Did certain disabilities make individuals more likely to wander into dangerous situations? Did they affect behavior in ways that increased risk? Or was the disability connection masking something else? Perhaps certain disabilities correlated with other traits like age, supervision patterns, or attraction to specific environmental features that were the real factors. The mystery of missing or discarded shoes appears so frequently in these cases that it demands closer examination. When shoes are found, they're often discovered miles from the victim's last known location. Sometimes in areas already searched, they're frequently placed neatly together rather than scattered as if lost during frantic movement. In cases where bodies are recovered without shoes, the feet often show surprisingly little damage, despite supposedly traveling long distances through rough terrain. This pattern appears across age groups and circumstances. Young children, experienced hikers, people found quickly, and those missing for weeks all show the same inexplicable shoe-related evidence. Some researchers have theorized that removing shoes might be an early symptom of hypothermia-induced confusion, but this fails to explain why it happens in moderate weather, or why the shoes end up in such peculiar locations. The shoe pattern appeared with sufficient frequency that search and rescue teams began specifically looking for discarded footwear as a potential clue in missing persons cases. In approximately 30% of cases where bodies were eventually recovered, the victims were found partially or completely barefoot, despite having worn proper footwear when they disappeared. The shoes were sometimes found separately, sometimes never recovered at all, and occasionally discovered in locations that raised more questions than they answered. In Jaryd Atadero's case, one shoe was found approximately 150 meters from where his remains were discovered. In a location that had been searched during the initial effort, the shoe appeared to have been placed there rather than lost during panicked flight. The second shoe was found in yet another location, also appearing deliberately placed rather than accidentally lost. The placement pattern appeared too frequently to be coincidental. Shoes found together, set side by side as if removed carefully and set down. Shoes discovered in locations that seemed illogical for someone to stop and remove footwear. Exposed ridges with sharp rocks, cold streams, steep slopes where bare feet would make travel more difficult rather than easier. The neat arrangement suggested deliberate removal under calm circumstances, yet the situations where these disappearances occurred didn't suggest calm deliberation. The condition of victims' feet when found without shoes added another layer to the mystery. Walking any significant distance barefoot through wilderness terrain produces characteristic injuries. Sharp rocks create cuts and punctures, rough ground causes severe abrasions, thorns and sticks embed in the soles, yet bodies found without shoes often showed minimal foot trauma relative to the distances they supposedly travelled and the terrain they crossed. Katherine van Alst's case exemplified this contradiction. Found barefoot after 4 days missing, having travelled nearly 2 miles across rocky terrain with 400 feet of elevation gain, her feet showed damage, but not the severe trauma that such a journey should have produced. The rocks in Devil's Den are sharp and uneven. Walking barefoot across them for any distance would typically shred unprotected feet. Yet Katherine's foot injuries were relatively moderate. The hypothermia explanation, while valid in some cases, couldn't account for the full pattern. Paradoxical undressing in late-stage hypothermia does cause victims to remove clothing, including shoes, due to the sensation of intense heat as blood vessels near the skin dilate. However, this occurs in the final stages before death, typically in genuinely cold conditions. Many of the shoe removal cases occurred in moderate temperatures, where hypothermia seemed unlikely within the time frame of the disappearance. Moreover, hypothermic undressing is typically frantic and disorganized. Victims tear at clothing, scatter items randomly, and show no concern for where garments land. Yet the shoes in these cases were often found carefully placed, neatly arranged, in locations separate from other clothing. This suggested different behavior than hypothermic confusion. The shoe evidence remained one of the most consistent yet inexplicable elements in the pattern. Too many cases involved missing or strangely placed footwear for it to be coincidence. Yet, no single explanation accounted for all the variations: the neat placement, the minimal foot damage, the occurrence in moderate weather, the discovery in previously searched locations. Like so many threads in the missing 411 cases, the shoe pattern was clear enough to be undeniable, yet obscure enough to resist explanation. The 72-hour pattern. When disappearances occur, there's often a curious meteorological pattern in the days that follow. Many cases report unusual weather moving into the search area within 24 to 72 hours of the vanishing sudden storms, unseasonable cold snaps, or dense fog banks that hamper search efforts. While this could be pure coincidence, the frequency of the pattern has caught researchers' attention. In Dennis Martin's case, rain moved in within 36 hours. Jaryd Atadero's search was complicated by early snow. Multiple cases in the Pacific Northwest reported unexpected fog banks rolling in shortly after the disappearance was reported. Whether this represents natural variation in mountain weather, observer bias in remembering dramatic weather during emotional events, or something more unusual remains open to debate. The pattern appears too consistent to ignore entirely, yet too irregular to constitute proof of connection. Mountain weather is notoriously unpredictable, with conditions capable of changing rapidly due to the complex interaction of elevation, terrain, and atmospheric systems. Anyone who has spent time in wilderness areas knows that sudden weather changes are more the rule than the exception. This natural variability made the weather pattern difficult to assess. Was it genuinely unusual? Or simply normal mountain conditions being noticed because they complicated an already stressful situation? Paulides documented the weather changes in cases where reliable meteorological data was available. The pattern that emerged showed weather changes occurring in roughly 60% of cases within 72 hours of the initial disappearance. The changes typically made searching more difficult: rain that could wash away scent trails and obscure tracks, fog that reduced visibility, snow that covered evidence, or unseasonable cold that reduced the survival window for the missing person. In Dennis Martin's case, clear skies on the day of his disappearance gave way to rain within 36 hours. The precipitation continued for several days, turning the search area muddy and eliminating any possibility of tracking footprints. The rain also would have degraded scent trails, making the bloodhounds' work more difficult. Some searchers noted the timing seemed particularly unfortunate. Had the weather held for another day or two, certain search techniques might have yielded better results. Jaryd Atadero disappeared on October 2nd, 1999 in Colorado. The weather was mild for early October, with temperatures in the comfortable range for hiking. Within 48 hours, an unseasonable cold front moved through, bringing snow to the high country where Jaryd had vanished. The snow complicated the search by covering any tracks or evidence that might have been visible, and by making the terrain more hazardous for search teams to navigate. Pacific Northwest cases showed a frequent pattern of fog banks moving into search areas. The fog would settle into valleys and drainages, reducing visibility to meters and making aerial searches useless. Ground teams would have to work in conditions where they could barely see beyond arm's length, significantly reducing search effectiveness. The fog would often persist for days before clearing, and in several cases, would return repeatedly throughout the search effort. Skeptics pointed out that adverse weather is common in mountain environments, and the human tendency toward pattern recognition might make normal weather variations seem significant during stressful events. Additionally, searches often lasted multiple days or weeks, increasing the likelihood that weather would change at some point during the effort. A search that lasted 10 days would almost certainly encounter some weather variation, simply due to the length of time involved. However, the specific timing of the weather changes often within the critical first 24 to 72 hours. When searches are most intensive and evidence is freshest, appeared more consistent than random chance would predict. The weather didn't just change sometime during the search. It often changed early, during the period when it would have maximum impact on search effectiveness. Some researchers speculated about whether the phenomenon causing the disappearances might somehow be connected to atmospheric or meteorological conditions. Could unusual electromagnetic events that preceded or accompanied the vanishings also trigger weather changes? Could the same atmospheric conditions that allowed disappearances to occur also make weather more unstable? These theories remained purely speculative, with no evidence beyond the correlation to support them. The 72-hour weather pattern remained in the category of intriguing but unproven correlations. It appeared too frequently to dismiss entirely, occurring in a majority of well-documented cases. Yet it also couldn't be conclusively separated from the natural weather variability of mountain environments or the observer bias of people noticing weather more acutely during crisis situations. When people return, in rare instances, missing persons in these cases are found alive, and when they are, their accounts often raise more questions than answers. Katherine van Alst's confused recollection of her 4 days missing didn't match the physical evidence. In other cases, found individuals report lost time, fragmented memories, or details that seem impossible given their physical condition and the terrain they supposedly crossed. Some describe feeling led or carried, though they can't explain what they mean. Others have gaps in their memory, accounting for all but a few hours of their absence without any explanation for that missing time. These survival cases should provide answers, but instead, they often deepen the mystery, suggesting that whatever is happening to these people might be even stranger than the disappearances themselves. The survival cases represented a small fraction of the total. Perhaps 5% of missing 411 cases ended with the person being found alive. When they were recovered, the circumstances often added layers of mystery rather than providing the explanations investigators hoped for. The survivors' accounts of their experiences frequently contained elements that didn't align with the physical evidence or the terrain where they were found. Katherine van Alst, found alive after 4 days, couldn't provide a coherent account of how she had travelled nearly 2 miles across difficult terrain to reach the location where searchers discovered her. Her description of where she had been didn't match the geography. She mentioned seeing things, buildings, people, features that didn't exist in the area. When questioned about her missing boots, she couldn't explain when or why she had removed them. Her memory of the 4 days was fragmentary at best, with long periods she simply couldn't account for. Another survival case involved a man found alive after being missing for several days in wilderness terrain he knew well. When questioned about his experience, he described periods of complete memory loss, hours at a time where he had no recollection of where he was or what he was doing. Between these gaps, he remembered being in locations that were miles apart, with no memory of travelling between them. He described feeling pulled in certain directions, though he couldn't explain what that sensation meant or what was pulling him. A child found alive after 2 days missing in national forest land told searchers he had been helped by someone, but couldn't describe who had helped him or what they looked like. When pressed for details, he became agitated and couldn't or wouldn't elaborate. The location where he was found was several miles from where he had disappeared, across terrain that should have been impossible for a child his age to navigate alone, especially in darkness. Yet he had no injuries consistent with such a journey, and his description of the experience suggested he didn't remember most of it. The lost time phenomenon appeared in multiple survival cases. Individuals would account for portions of their missing period but have gaps, sometimes hours, sometimes entire days, where they had no memory of what had occurred. These weren't the vague recollections of traumatic events that stress and fear might explain. They were complete absences of memory, clean breaks where continuous experience should have been. Some survivors described altered perceptions during their missing period. Time seeming to move differently, with hours passing like minutes or minutes stretching like hours. Distances appearing wrong, with landmarks seeming closer or farther than they actually were. Sounds being muffled or distorted. These descriptions suggested disorientation, but the specific nature of the perceptual changes was oddly consistent across different individuals who had no contact with each other. The physical condition of survivors often didn't match their supposed experiences. People found after days in the wilderness without food or water should show severe dehydration and weight loss, yet some survivors appeared in better condition than expected. Conversely, some showed specific injuries or conditions that didn't align with the terrain, where they had supposedly been minor scratches when severe injuries should have occurred, or unusual patterns of exposure that didn't match the weather conditions. The survival cases should have been the key to understanding the phenomenon. Here were people who had experienced whatever happened and lived to tell about it, yet their accounts often raised more questions than they answered, suggesting that even they didn't fully understand what had happened to them. The fragmented memories, the lost time, the impossible journeys, the confused recollections, all pointed to experiences that didn't fit normal categories of getting lost in the wilderness. The people who dedicate their lives to wilderness search and rescue often speak carefully about these cases. But privately, many admit the experiences have shaken their understanding of what's possible. Veteran searchers with decades of experience described these cases as fundamentally different from typical missing person searches. The complete absence of clues, the terminated scent trails, the impossible locations where bodies eventually appear. These elements combine to create a profound sense of unease. Some searchers report feelings of being watched in certain areas, or experiencing unusual sounds and phenomena during searches. While these subjective reports don't constitute evidence, the consistency with which experienced professionals describe similar feelings across different locations and cases suggests these searches affect even the most rational, trained observers in ways that ordinary search operations do not. Search and rescue personnel are typically pragmatic individuals, trained to work methodically through difficult situations without letting emotion interfere with their effectiveness. They've seen tragedy, worked in harsh conditions, and dealt with the worst outcomes. Yet when veteran SAR workers discuss missing 411 cases, a different tone enters their voices, a hesitation, a careful choice of words that suggest they're treading on uncomfortable ground. One SAR coordinator, with over 30 years of experience, described the Dennis Martin search as the case that changed how he viewed his work. The complete absence of any physical evidence, despite hundreds of searches covering every inch of terrain, didn't fit any pattern he'd seen before or since. He described moments during that search where the forest felt wrong, a subjective assessment he had trouble articulating, but that other team members independently reported feeling in the same areas. Multiple searchers across different cases have reported similar sensations in specific locations, a feeling of being observed despite no one being visible, sounds that seemed to come from no identifiable source, footsteps that stopped when searchers paused, voices that called out but never resolved into actual people, movements in peripheral vision that vanished when looked at directly. These reports came from trained observers who understood the tricks that stress and exhaustion could play on perception. Yet they insisted these experiences felt qualitatively different. Some SAR personnel reported reluctance to work certain areas after experiencing these sensations. Not fear exactly, but a strong, intuitive sense that something about the location wasn't right. In a few cases, searchers asked to be reassigned to different sectors rather than continue working areas where they felt this unease, even though they couldn't rationally justify the request. The psychological toll of unsuccessful searches was compounded in missing 411 cases by the absence of closure. In normal searches that ended without recovery, SAR teams could at least construct probable scenarios. The victim fell in an inaccessible location. Remains were scattered by animals. Evidence was destroyed by weather. But in cases where every logical explanation had been systematically ruled out, searchers were left with no framework to process the failure. Some reported the cases haunting them for years, occasionally waking with new ideas about where to search or what might have happened, unable to let go of the mystery. The impact extended to how some SAR personnel viewed wilderness areas themselves. Several veteran searchers admitted that certain locations in parks now carried associations. They couldn't shake specific meadows, particular trails, certain boulder fields where people had vanished. They would work these areas if assigned, but they approached them differently, with heightened alertness and an unease they rarely felt elsewhere. Some skeptics propose that animal predation accounts for these disappearances, that children are quickly taken by mountain lions or bears, and the remains consumed or scattered beyond recovery. While large predators do occasionally attack humans, this theory fails on multiple fronts. First, predator attacks typically leave abundant evidence. Blood, disturbed ground, torn clothing, witnesses reporting sounds of struggle. None of that appears in these cases. Second, predators don't hunt in broad daylight on crowded trails with humans nearby. Third, they don't carry victims miles into areas already searched, then deposit bodies there years later. Fourth, the scent trails would lead to kill sites, not simply terminate in midair. While predation may explain a tiny fraction of wilderness deaths, it cannot account for the core mysteries that define these disappearance patterns. The predator theory gained traction because it offered a natural, if tragic, explanation that required no mysterious forces or unexplained phenomena. Mountain lions, bears, and other large predators do inhabit many of the areas where disappearances occur. These animals are capable of taking prey quickly and silently, and in theory could take a small child before anyone could react. However, the theory collapsed when examined against actual predator behavior and attack evidence. Mountain lions, the predator most often cited in these theories, are ambush hunters that typically attack from behind, targeting the neck and skull. Attacks leave characteristic evidence: drag marks where the predator pulls prey to cover, blood at the attack site, disturbed ground from the struggle, and often cached remains where the lion has buried prey for later consumption. None of these signs appeared in missing 411 cases. Bear attacks, while different in character from mountain lion predation, also leave unmistakable evidence. Bears are large, powerful animals that create massive disturbance when attacking. They leave tracks, scat, torn vegetation, and typically consume prey on sight rather than carrying it away. Their attacks are loud and violent, producing sounds that carry considerable distances, yet cases like Dennis Martin's, where family members were within earshot, reported no sounds of struggle or attack. The timing and location of disappearances also contradicted predator theory. Large predators avoid humans and typically hunt during dawn and dusk hours, when prey is most active and visibility favours their ambush tactics. The missing 411 cases clustered in afternoon hours on well-travelled trails, with multiple people present exactly when and where predators would be least likely to hunt. The complete absence of physical evidence was perhaps the most damning flaw in the predator theory. Even if a predator somehow attacked and killed a victim without witnesses, the attack site would show evidence: blood on vegetation, disturbed soil, torn clothing at minimum. Yet searches of the areas where victims vanished found nothing. No blood, no torn fabric, no signs of struggle. The scent trail evidence further undermined the theory. Dogs tracking victims would follow their scent to the attack site, where they would encounter the predator's scent as well. Predators have strong, distinctive odours that tracking dogs readily detect. Yet in missing 411 cases, dogs found victim scent trails that simply terminated, with no predator scent present at the termination point. Some researchers have proposed that victims fall into unmapped cave systems or hidden underground passages, which would explain the lack of surface evidence and the difficulty in recovery. Certain park areas do sit atop extensive cave networks. However, this theory struggles with several problems. First, falling into a concealed opening would typically result in injury evidence, disturbed ground, and other signs detectable to search teams. Second, cave openings large enough for a person to fall through are relatively rare and would be noticed during systematic searches. Third, this doesn't explain disappearances in areas with no known karst geology or cave systems. Fourth, it fails to account for bodies later found on the surface in previously searched areas. While underground spaces might contribute to some cases, they cannot explain the broader pattern or the most puzzling evidence. The cave theory held intuitive appeal, particularly in parks known for limestone geology and extensive underground systems. Carlsbad Caverns, Mammoth Cave, and other famous cave networks demonstrated that vast underground spaces could exist beneath seemingly solid ground. The theory proposed that victims encountered unmapped cave openings, concealed by vegetation or thin soil, and fell into underground passages where recovery would be extremely difficult or impossible. In areas with confirmed karst topography, limestone bedrock where caves naturally form, the theory had some merit. Small sinkholes and cave openings do occasionally appear, sometimes concealed until someone steps on thin soil that collapses. Such falls would remove the victim from the surface search area and potentially place them in spaces that standard search techniques wouldn't cover. However, the theory failed to account for key evidence. Cave falls typically produce noise, the sound of breaking vegetation, the cry of the falling person, the impact at the bottom. Yet disappearances like Dennis Martin's occurred in complete silence, despite family members being close enough to hear. Falls into caves also disturbed the ground at the opening, creating a depression or hole that would be visible to systematic searches. None of the heavily searched areas showed such disturbances. The geology of many disappearance locations contradicted the cave theory. Cases occurred in areas with granite bedrock, volcanic rock, or other geological formations where caves don't naturally form. The absence of karst geology in these locations meant there were no cave systems to fall into. Yet the disappearances followed the same pattern as those in cave-prone areas. Bodies eventually found on the surface posed another fatal problem for the theory. If victims had fallen into underground spaces, their remains should stay underground. Yet in cases like Jaryd Atadero's, remains appeared on the surface years later in locations that had been searched multiple times. The cave theory offered no mechanism for how bodies would migrate from underground back to the surface. The scent trail evidence also contradicted underground concealment. Dogs tracking to a cave opening where someone had fallen would show intense interest at that specific spot, likely attempting to follow the scent into the opening. Yet dogs in missing 411 cases showed confusion and trail termination rather than focused interest on a specific ground location. After examining hundreds of cases across decades and thousands of square miles, certain questions persist with uncomfortable consistency. How do people vanish in seconds from open terrain under observation? Why do scent trails terminate abruptly, as if the person ceased to exist? What explains the clustering around specific geographical features? Why do some victims turn up in places already searched, sometimes years later? What accounts for the profile patterns, the age groups, the disabilities, the hair color, the time of day? Why do so many cases involve missing shoes or partial undressing in conditions where such behavior makes no sense? And perhaps most troubling, why has no official agency compiled comprehensive data or acknowledged the pattern? These aren't questions born from speculation or conspiracy thinking. They emerge directly from the documented evidence, the testimony of trained searchers, and the experiences of hundreds of families left without answers. Whatever is happening in North America's wilderness areas, it's been happening for a very long time. It follows identifiable patterns, and we are no closer to understanding it than we were when Dennis Martin vanished into the trees more than 50 years ago. The temporal impossibility remains the most fundamental question. Dennis Martin vanished in under 10 seconds. Keith Parkins disappeared in under 30 seconds. Samuel Boehlke was gone within 2 minutes. These time frames don't allow for normal disappearance mechanisms. A child can't walk far enough in 10 seconds to move beyond the search radius that found nothing. The speed of these vanishings suggests something happening instantaneously, rather than gradually. The scent trail terminations defy physics as we understand it. Human scent doesn't simply stop existing at a point in space. It disperses through air, deposits on surfaces, and gradually fades over distance and time. Yet tracking dogs repeatedly found trails that ended abruptly and completely, as if the source of scent had been removed from that location instantly. No conventional explanation accounts for this behavior across hundreds of independent cases. The geographical clustering points to location-specific factors, yet no common element has been identified. Granite bedrock appears in some clusters but not others. Water proximity shows correlation but isn't universal. Elevation varies wildly across cluster sites. The precision of the clustering multiple cases within 200-meter radiuses suggests the relevant factor operates at very local scales, yet remains invisible to analysis. The profile pattern's age, hair color, intelligence, disabilities suggest selection or susceptibility based on specific characteristics. Random wilderness accidents shouldn't show preferences for red-headed children, individuals with high IQs, or people with autism. The statistical significance of these patterns indicates they're real, yet their meaning remains obscure. The delayed discoveries in previously searched areas violate basic principles of search methodology. Professional teams don't miss bodies in areas they've thoroughly covered, especially when searching multiple times. Yet bodies appear years later in locations that were systematically searched, showing no evidence of having been moved there after initial searches concluded. The official silence compounds the mystery. The absence of centralized data collection suggests either institutional failure to recognize the pattern or deliberate avoidance of acknowledging it. Either explanation is troubling. One implies incompetence in a critical public safety area. The other implies knowledge being withheld. These questions accumulate into a pattern that resists conventional explanation while remaining too consistent and well documented to dismiss. Something is happening in wilderness areas that operates outside normal categories of getting lost, animal attacks, or environmental hazards. The phenomenon has identifiable characteristics and follows statistical patterns, yet its nature and mechanism remain completely unknown. In the remote northern reaches of Canada, where winter's grip can linger for months, and the wind carries with it the scent of untouched pine forests. There once stood a small settlement known as Anjikuni. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where the few cabins that lined the frozen lake stood like sentinels against the cold, and where visitors were so rare that their arrival would be remembered for years. Yet one day, in the early 1932, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle came upon the village to find an unsettling silence, the kind that doesn't just signal absence, but feels almost unnatural, as if something had deliberately swept life away. The snow lay undisturbed around the homes, and the front doors stood open, groaning quietly in the wind, inviting him to see what had been left behind. What struck LaBelle first was how everything seemed frozen in time, as though the people had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. Pots of stew still hung over cold stoves, half-eaten meals sat on tables, and clothing lay draped over chairs, waiting for an owner who would never put them on again. The dogs, normally tethered to posts outside, were nowhere to be found, though some reports would later say they were discovered dead. Starved despite being close to food supplies. The absence of footprints, sled tracks, or any other sign of movement was perhaps the most chilling detail. Snow had fallen since their disappearance, but there should have been some evidence that a mass departure had taken place. Instead, the village stood as if sealed away from the world, its story locked inside the stillness. Searching from cabin to cabin, LaBelle found no signs of struggle, no broken doors, no overturned furniture. It was as though the people had calmly stopped whatever they were doing, set their belongings down, and walked into the white wilderness without any apparent reason. In one dwelling, a rifle rested by the door with a full magazine, something that no hunter or trapper would willingly leave behind in such a remote region. The food stores were untouched, and valuables lay where they had always been. If there had been a threat, it had left no trace of itself behind. When LaBelle finally left to alert the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the journey back felt heavier than when he'd first come. The Mounties dispatched to investigate confirmed every detail LaBelle had given them, but they were equally unable to determine where the villagers had gone or why they had left so suddenly. In some accounts, the Mounties found graves in the small burial ground disturbed, as if something or someone had dug them open. Though official records on this point remain unclear, the case became one of those mysteries spoken of in hushed tones, a reminder of how quickly the mountains could take and never return.